Revan's strength wasn't about raw power or spectacle, it came from something harder to measure and more dangerous to face. He survived confrontations with opponents who should have destroyed him, endured defeats that would have broken anyone else, and remained a threat long after most would have been forgotten. What we found digging through Star Wars Legends sources reveals something conventional rankings overlook. This video examines his actual capabilities, his defeats, and why his limits mattered more than raw force power ever could. Chapter 1. Force Control. Most debates about force strength begin with output. Viewers look for the largest lightning storm, the widest telekinetic shockwave, or the most overwhelming display of battlefield dominance. Judged strictly on that scale, Revan does not rank among the very highest figures in Legends. The Sith Emperor Vishet commands reserves of dark side energy that exceed his, and Sidious demonstrates sustained destructive capability on a similarly elevated tier. Yoda's luminous mastery appears more refined and internally stable, and even Vader at his peak often exhibits heavier immediate telekinetic impact. Revan's advantage was never sheer volume, it was a regulation under pressure. That distinction becomes visible during his confrontation with Vishet on Dromund Kaas. Instead of escalating immediately into a direct power contest, Revan opens himself to both the light and dark sides of the Force simultaneously. This act alone carries extreme risk, since most practitioners align strongly with one current to prevent destabilization. Revan tolerates the internal strain deliberately, drawing from both sides without surrendering to either. He does not channel that energy into a refined strike or a singular lightning blast. He releases it outward in a controlled surge. The burst is powerful enough to stagger him as well, but it disrupts the Emperor because Vishet is dividing attention between mental domination and physical assault. Revan does not exceed the Emperor's reserves. He exploits divided focus and timing. The same principle governs his duel with Darth Nihilus of the Jedi Council. When Nihilus unleashes heavy force lightning, Revan absorbs and redirects the energy rather than attempting to overwhelm her with greater output. In that encounter, the volume remains within his tolerance threshold, and control proves sufficient. Nihilus falls. The contrast between these two confrontations clarifies his tier. Against elite Sith Lords such as Nihilus, Revan's regulatory discipline allows him to compete and win decisively. Against Vishet, whose power output operates on a larger scale, the same method reaches its limit. When the Emperor later gathers darkside energy for a massive lightning assault, Revan again attempts absorption and containment. This time, the energy floods his system faster than it can be stabilized. Lightning burns through muscle and skin, and recovery cannot keep pace with the incoming force. The technique remains sound. The scale surpasses what it can manage. That moment defines his ceiling in raw power. He exceeds Malak decisively in efficiency and control, and he can defeat members of the Jedi Council individually, but he cannot indefinitely contain the Emperor's full output. Force control for Revan extends beyond physical exchanges. After his initial defeat and psychic domination, he does not respond by seeking greater aggression. Instead, he studies the structure of the Emperor's intrusion. When he returns, he states plainly that he now understands how Vishet invades the mind and can shield his thoughts more effectively. This defense is architectural rather than emotional. He reshapes internal pathways instead of relying on rage or suppression. His evolving philosophy reflects that discipline. Rather than treating the light and dark sides as mutually exclusive moral camps, he begins to view them as currents that can be accessed without surrendering identity. That perspective grants flexibility and resilience, allowing him to operate between extremes without collapsing into either. Yet, flexibility does not equal limitless capacity. Control allowed Revan to survive above his natural tier, but it did not change the hierarchy. When volume exceeded capacity, the technique stopped compensating. That boundary forces the conversation towards adaptability. Chapter 2. Combat Adaptability. Control stabilizes a confrontation, but adaptability determines whether someone survives it. Many Force users build their reputations on dueling records alone: who they defeated, who defeated them, and how decisively the outcome unfolded. That metric only tells part of the story. Some combatants dominate through sheer force. Vader overwhelms opponents with crushing telekinetic pressure and relentless forward aggression. Yoda relies on refined precision and speed that few can match. Sidious combines deception with bursts of overwhelming dark side output. Revan operates differently. His advantage lies not in being the fastest or the most destructive, but in recalibrating the fight before his opponent fully understands that the conditions have changed. During the assault on the Emperor's throne room, this pattern appears clearly. When one of the Imperial guards breaks away from battling Mitra Surik and intercepts Revan, the guard anticipates a direct engagement, blade meeting blade, power against power. Instead, Revan shifts the geometry of the exchange immediately. He launches upward and somersaults cleanly over the guard, reversing their positions in a single motion. The move is not theatrical, it is disruptive. The guard must turn, reorient, and reacquire target alignment in a fraction of a second. By the time the adjustment is complete, Revan has already advanced the fight one step further. He follows with telekinetic force to destabilize the guard's stance, then delivers an overhand strike designed to draw a high parry. The guard responds correctly, dropping his blade to intercept the anticipated follow-up. Revan never commits to that pattern. He anticipates the guard's competence and exploits it. The opening forms not because the opponent is weak, but because Revan models the response ahead of time. The exchange ends in a single decisive motion. This layered anticipation separates him from Malak. Malak possesses formidable raw strength and aggressive momentum, but his style commits heavily to forward pressure. Revan anticipates that pressure and turns it against him. In their broader conflict, the gap between them is not one of scale but of processing. Malak pushes, Revan adjusts, reframes, and counters before the push completes. That difference proves decisive. Revan's adaptability extends beyond lightsaber combat. While piloting the Ebon Hawk through the violent ice storms of Rekiad, the ship's instruments became unreliable under turbulence and interference. A conventional pilot would rely on delayed data, correcting course only after instability becomes visible. Revan shifts to force-assisted predictive navigation. He senses motion trends before they fully manifest, adjusting trajectory based on what the ship is about to do rather than what it has already done. The principle mirrors his dueling philosophy. He does not react faster than others, he reacts earlier. Even in larger engagements, he alters conditions rather than trading blows unnecessarily. When Imperial reinforcements move to support the throne room defense, Revan tears a vaulted stone archway from the ceiling and collapses it into their path. Dust, debris, and shattered stone block their advance and fracture their formation before a direct clash can begin. In that moment, he does not demonstrate superior output. He removes the environment that allows the enemy to fight effectively. The confrontation ends before it scales upward. Comparing him to Vader clarifies this distinction further. Vader often wins through sustained dominance, pressing opponents into submission through overwhelming physicality and fear. Revan prefers destabilization, disruption, and positional manipulation. Where Vader's strength compounds through pressure, Revan's compounds through shifting variables. Against conventional Sith Lords or elite guards, this style places him comfortably above them. Against figures operating at the Emperor's tier, adaptability can buy survival time, but cannot erase the raw differential. That boundary is important. Adaptability allows Revan to compete above his output class and to defeat opponents who might match or slightly exceed him in immediate power. It does not grant immunity against beings whose scale eclipses his entirely. Still, this constant recalibration gives him a critical advantage: unpredictability. Predictable fighters often eventually fall. Revan refuses to remain predictable in physical combat, in strategy, or even in ideology. He changes methods before patterns fully form, forcing opponents to chase a moving framework rather than confront a fixed one. Yet, even adaptability operates within active conflict. It modifies the present moment. Revan's most dangerous advantage often appears earlier, before blades ignite and lightning gathers, when outcomes are still fluid and the battlefield itself has not yet been defined. Chapter 3: Strategic Foresight. Adaptability keeps someone alive once a fight has begun. Strategic foresight determines whether the fight unfolds at all. Revan's combat skill places him comfortably among elite duelists of his era, but his strategic intelligence arguably ranks even higher. Few Force users and legends consistently demonstrate the ability to fight, analyze, and restructure future outcomes at the same time. Yoda embodies wisdom and long-term patience. Insidious masters political manipulation across decades. Revan operates somewhere between those models. He combines battlefield immediacy with systems-level thinking, allowing him to shape conflicts before they escalate. This mindset becomes visible in how he treats Force visions. Jedi often interpret visions symbolically through meditation, while Sith focus on immediate advantage. Revan approaches them as intelligence. When he experiences recurring imagery of a storm-covered world, he does not assume destiny. He treats visions as intelligence rather than prophecy. When recurring imagery remains clear and persistent, instead of fading like a dream, he assumes it signals buried memory or probability and acts accordingly. Visions become probability indicators rather than prophecy. Instead of surrendering to fate, he uses them to guide his investigation. His return to Rekiad follows this logic. He identifies the world from his visions as tied to suppressed memories and restructures his strategy accordingly. The future is not fixed in his framework. It is a variable that can be influenced. His handling of the Mandalorian Wars provides an even clearer example of foresight operating at scale. Many commanders defeat enemies through superior tactics in open battle. Revan studies Mandalorian culture itself. He recognizes that their cohesion depends not merely on military leadership, but on symbolic legitimacy. The Mask of Mandalore is not decorative armor, it is the artifact that authorizes succession and unifies the clans. When he defeats Mandalore, the ultimate in single combat, the conventional path would have been execution and territorial victory. Revan instead removes the mask and hides it, severing the symbolic mechanism that enables unified command. The result is fragmentation that lasts generations. In terms of raw combat ability, this act required little additional effort. In terms of long-term consequences, it proved devastating. Where Sidious engineers slow institutional decay through manipulation and secrecy, Revan accomplishes systemic fracture through targeted symbolic removal. The scale differs, but the strategic tier is comparable. This foresight also governs his behavior under immediate threat. During the throne room confrontation on Dromund Kaas, when Vishet begins gathering energy for a large-scale lightning assault, Revan calculates distance and timing within seconds. Closing the gap physically is impossible before the attack completes. Attempting to interrupt directly would fail. He therefore chooses absorption and containment as the only viable option. The choice is not emotional or heroic, it is probabilistic. Although the attempt ultimately fails due to the Emperor's overwhelming output, the decision itself reflects an accurate assessment rather than panic. Revan does not misjudge the situation, he simply operates below the necessary scale to overcome it. Comparing him to Malak again clarifies the difference. Malak responds to threats with escalation. Revan responds with modeling. He anticipates the secondary and tertiary effects of each decision before committing. That layered thinking allows him to conserve resources, avoid unnecessary confrontations, and choose engagements selectively. It also allows him to recognize when outright victory is unattainable and to redefine success accordingly. However, foresight depends on modeling incentives accurately. Enemies driven by domination, ambition, or survival are predictable within Sith logic. The Emperor's motives are extreme, but internally consistent. Where this predictive system becomes vulnerable is in moments when incentives shift unexpectedly. Foresight can map hostile intent with remarkable precision. It becomes less reliable when trust fractures inside an alliance. That vulnerability does not surface immediately, but it remains embedded within Revan's otherwise formidable strategic architecture. Strategic foresight elevated him beyond conventional Sith Lords and placed him in the same analytical tier as the most calculating figures in legends. Yet, even the most refined models depend on stable variables. When those variables change without warning, even the best predictions can collapse. Chapter 4: Psychological Warfare. Strategic foresight allows someone to predict outcomes. Psychological warfare allows them to shape the conditions that produce those outcomes. Revan did not approach combat as a series of isolated victories. He approached it as an opportunity to restructure what would remain after the fighting stopped. Many Sith dominate through fear and spectacle, relying on overwhelming power to secure obedience. Vishet subjugates through psychic terror and planetary annihilation. Sidious engineers paranoia and institutional decay. Revan's method is subtler and often more durable. He studies what binds an enemy together and removes it. The Mandalorian conflict provides the clearest illustration. Mandalorian society does not revolve solely around military hierarchy or territory. It revolves around legitimacy anchored in tradition. The Mask of Mandalore is the artifact that authorizes leadership and unifies the clans under a single Mandalore. After defeating Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat, Revan understands that killing the leader is insufficient. Another warrior could claim the mask and restore unity. By removing the mask, he doesn't just defeat a leader, he fractures succession itself. The clans splinter, and no single Mandalore can restore unity. The result is not immediate annihilation, but long-term fragmentation. Clans compete, splinter, and lose cohesion. The war ends not only because armies are defeated, but because the cultural structure that could rebuild them has been severed. That move required no greater display of force power than the duel itself, yet its strategic impact surpassed what most battlefield victories achieve. Comparing this to Malak highlights the difference in psychological scope. Malak rules through intimidation and visible dominance, projecting strength outward to maintain control. His empire depends heavily on his personal presence. When he falls, cohesion collapses quickly. Revan, by contrast, thinks in terms of systemic durability. His actions outlast him. In this respect, he aligns more closely with Sidious's long-game manipulation, though their methods diverge. Sidious corrodes institutions from within through deception and stage crises. Revan strikes at symbolic foundations directly and then steps back, allowing fragmentation to unfold naturally. His psychological leverage extends beyond enemies. Years after the Mandalorian Wars, operating under the alias Avner, Revan interacts with Mandalorian clans not through open hostility, but through controlled information flow. He provides selective intelligence about Republic movements and battle records. He does not threaten or dominate them through forced intimidation. Instead, he shapes their perception of him as a useful intermediary. By managing information asymmetry, he influences decisions without overt coercion. That approach reflects confidence in structural leverage rather than reliance on visible power. The same discipline appears in his dealings with the Jedi Council after his redemption. Several masters regard him as permanently compromised and potentially dangerous. Escalation would have been possible. Revan possessed sufficient ability to challenge authority directly or fracture the order through ideological confrontation. Instead, he negotiates containment. The Council refrains from publicly opposing his marriage to Bastila, and he agrees not to spread his unorthodox Force philosophy within the Order. He avoids turning suspicion into open conflict. In this scenario, victory does not require domination. It requires preventing institutional escalation. This style of psychological engagement places Revan above most conventional Sith Lords in strategic maturity. He does not rely on fear as a default tool. He does not depend on brute superiority to compel obedience. He narrows the range of viable choices available to others until the path he prefers becomes the most stable option. Against ordinary opponents or fragmented factions, this method proves highly effective. Against figures like Vishet, psychological leverage alone cannot halt momentum driven by annihilation-level power. Still, psychological warfare amplifies Revan's overall power profile. It allows him to multiply the effects of his actions without matching the raw output of beings above him. He does not need to be the most destructive individual in a room if he can restructure what the room represents. That multiplier effect explains why his influence persists even after apparent defeat. However, influence alone cannot substitute for resilience when direct agency is removed. Eventually, his strength would be tested not through manipulation or prediction, but through prolonged confinement under overwhelming force. Chapter 5. Endurance. Power can decide a duel. Endurance decides whether someone remains relevant after losing one. Revan's resilience was not measured in single confrontations, but across extended periods of psychological and physical strain that would have erased most Force users entirely. If raw output defines the upper ceiling of characters like Vishet or Sidious, endurance defines the category where Revan becomes exceptional. The first major test of that resilience occurs after the Jedi Council erases his memory. The procedure does not simply suppress surface knowledge, it fractures identity. When fragments of his past begin resurfacing, the recovery remains incomplete. He never fully regains the person he once was. Instead of attempting to reconstruct a perfect continuity, he accepts the gaps. He rebuilds functionality around absence. That psychological adjustment matters. Many Sith derive strength from a consolidated sense of self anchored in ambition or rage. Revan adapts to discontinuity without collapsing into instability. He resumes research, strengthens alliances, and investigates emerging threats beyond the Outer Rim, despite knowing parts of his history are permanently inaccessible. This capacity to operate coherently while internally incomplete already places him above most Jedi or Sith in long-term stability. The most extreme test begins after his defeat on Dromund Kaas. Vishet does not execute him. He imprisons him in suspended confinement, conscious yet immobilized, subjected to repeated psychic intrusion. Escape is impossible. Overpowering the Emperor is not an option. Under ordinary scaling logic, this situation ends in total domination. Instead, imprisonment becomes a prolonged contest of resistance. Vishet probes constantly for intelligence regarding the Republic and the Jedi. Every answer exists within Revan's mind, close enough to extract. Revan restructures his thoughts to make extraction slow and costly, and cannot block the Emperor outright, but he complicates access. Each intrusion requires sustained effort. Over time, he realizes the link runs both ways. During rare lapses in the Emperor's focus, he pushes back subtly, not to dominate, but to slow. Victory becomes unrealistic, delay becomes measurable. Where most Sith pursue immediate supremacy, Revan adapts to duration. He cannot defeat the Emperor, but he can prevent effortless erasure. Few figures in legend sustain that level of prolonged resistance against someone operating above them in raw power. Revan cannot defeat the Emperor outright, but he prevents effortless erasure. In conflicts defined by annihilation, remaining unbroken becomes its own form of influence. However, endurance does not negate ceilings. Remaining coherent under pressure is not the same as being immune to defeat. Eventually, scale reasserts itself, and the structural limits of Revan's system become unavoidable. Chapter 6: Power Ceiling. Endurance explains how long Revan lasted. It does not explain why he ultimately fell. His defining limitation was not intelligence, adaptability, or discipline. It was scale. No refinement of control could permanently bridge the raw output gap between him and the Sith Emperor Vishet. That differential is not implied, it is demonstrated directly. By the time of their final confrontation, the hierarchy is already clear. Revan can defeat Dark Council members. He cannot match Vishet's full destructive scale. When the Emperor commits fully, the output gap becomes decisive. This distinction anchors his position clearly within Legend scaling. He stands decisively above Malak in both efficiency and battlefield cognition. He competes successfully against Dark Council members, such as Nyrus. He does not operate at the same raw tier as Vishet, and likely not at Sidious's highest peak either, where Yoda represents luminous refinement at its apex, and Vishet represents destructive magnitude at its extreme. Revan occupies a tier defined by balance, flexibility, and calculated leverage. That tier is formidable, but it is not absolute. Yet, raw power alone does not end him. The decisive factor in the throne room confrontation is betrayal. Lord Scourge receives a Force vision indicating that survival lies in submission rather than resistance. Unlike Revan's analytical treatment of visions as data points to be interpreted, Scourge interprets this vision as directive. In this critical moment, instead of advancing alongside Revan and Mitra Surik against a briefly destabilized Emperor, Scourge turns and strikes Mitra from behind. The act removes one of the few stabilizing variables in the confrontation. Revan's predictive framework excels at modeling hostile intent. Sith motivations, ambition, domination, survival follow recognizable patterns. What destabilizes his system is incentive shift within an ally during live engagement. Scourge's decision to prioritize personal survival over shared objective falls outside the immediate parameters Revan has modeled. The shock is not philosophical, it is structural. A single variable changes and the predictive architecture collapses just long enough for Vishet to capitalize. The Emperor delivers the final blow, while Revan's attention fractures between grief and recalibration. That moment defines his ultimate limitation. He does not lose because he misunderstands the Force. He does not lose because his strategic thinking fails under pressure. He loses because scale and unpredictability converge at once. The Emperor's raw tier exceeds him, and an internal betrayal removes the margin his adaptability required to compensate. Even in defeat, however, elimination fails. Revan remains imprisoned rather than erased. His continued resistance slows Vishet's larger designs, alerting timelines in ways the Emperor cannot immediately undo. In practical scaling terms, he is not the strongest Force user of his era. He does not surpass Vishet, and he likely does not surpass Sidious at their peaks. He stands above Malak and most conventional Sith Lords, competes effectively against Dark Council members, and rivals figures like Vader in adaptability while exceeding him in long-range strategic foresight. Revan's power profile ultimately rests on an unusual combination of traits. He lacks the highest raw output. He does not embody pure luminous mastery like Yoda. He does not command annihilation-level magnitude like Vishet. What he possesses instead is sustained leverage across multiple domains, control under pressure, adaptability in motion, foresight in planning, psychological restructuring of enemies, and endurance across time. Those strengths allow him to survive encounters he cannot win outright, and to remain consequential even when structurally outmatched. In a galaxy where ultimate power is often measured by who can generate the largest storm of lightning, Revan's legacy rests on something quieter but harder to extinguish. He cannot overpower the Sith Emperor. He cannot prevent betrayal. But even after defeat, he remained a variable that the most powerful being in the galaxy can never fully eliminate. That persistence, measured against opponents who outscaled him, defines the true boundary of his strength. Revan cannot overpower the Sith Emperor. He cannot prevent betrayal. Yet, even after defeat, he remained a variable that the most powerful being in the galaxy could not eliminate. In a universe defined by annihilation-level power, persistence against overwhelming scale may be the rarest strength of all. Meanwhile, his enemies kept careful files on him. The order that trained him made sure no one would ever read theirs. For centuries, no name strained that rule more than Revan's. He had begun as a Padawan, risen to knight, then master, and with each step had become harder to define. He was hailed as a hero, denounced as a traitor, feared as a conqueror, and remembered as a savior. He had worn the robes of the Jedi, and later the armor of the Sith. He had saved the Republic, then tried to destroy it, then saved it again. So when he stood before the Council for the last time, the Masters could not agree on what to do with him. A handful wanted him cast out of the Order entirely. Others chose a quieter path. They would not disown him, and they would not embrace him. The tale of his redemption and return to the light spread across the galaxy, but the darker details of what the Jedi had done to him were carefully removed. The man behind the legend was locked inside the walls of the temple, and the parts of his life that did not suit the Order were shut away. This is the history the Council could not control, so they buried it. It begins with a war they refused to fight. It started in the Outer Rim, where Mandalorian raiders began striking Republic colonies on a scale the Senate could no longer dismiss. The scope of that campaign is charted in Legends reference works like the New Essential Chronology and Star Wars The Essential Atlas, which trace the war world by worlds across the Rim. What those records track is the movement of fleets. What the novel Revan sits with is the part the maps cannot show, the moment the Council chose not to respond. Whole worlds lived in fear, and as refugees streamed towards the core, pressure built for someone to act. The Republic Senate debated and delayed. The Jedi Council, sitting in its halls on Coruscant, chose to wait. That choice created the space for one young Jedi Knight to do the opposite. His name was Revan. With him was his closest friend and apprentice Malak. The Council would not move. They left the temple for the Outer Worlds and did what the Masters had refused to do. The Council opposed them openly and offered them to stand down. Revan and Malak ignored them. Instead, they pulled Jedi from across the Order, knights, Padawans, former students, even those who had drifted from active service, and marched them into the war alongside Republic soldiers. What began as defiance quickly hardened into something larger, a chain of command of their own, built beyond the Council's reach. One of the first to join them was a young woman named Mitra Surik. Because she quickly proved herself a brilliant tactician and a natural military leader, Revan recognized her value at once, made her a general, and placed nearly half of the combined Republic and Jedi forces under her command. This was no longer a disagreement because what Revan had created in the field had already become a second Jedi hierarchy, complete with its own ranks and its own officers. Back at the temple, the old masters watched the war from a distance. Among them was Atris, once close to Mitra, and now firmly aligned with the Council's most conservative view. She had stayed out of the fighting because she believed, as they did, that Revan's defiance could not be allowed to stand, but on the battlefield, that judgment mattered less with every victory he won. Revan's army was the force actually turning the war. It met the Mandalorians world by world, system by system, and every success made his name larger across the galaxy. That was exactly what made him more dangerous inside the Order. Each victory strengthened his legend. Each loss only hardened the masters against him. Some resented the cost in Jedi lives. Others resented something simpler and more threatening. Revan had shown that he could lead without them. As the war dragged on, the divide only deepened. Worlds burned, colonies were lost and retaken, and young Jedi who had known only the Temple learned instead how to command troops, survive campaigns, and bury the dead. By the end, the conflict was no longer just a war against the Mandalorians. It had become a struggle over who would define the future of the Jedi Order itself. Revan meant to settle both struggles with one final victory, and that was why he chose Malachor 5. The planet mattered less than the space around it, where violent gravitational anomalies could be turned into a weapon. He already had that weapon prepared. The mass shadow generator. It appears not only in the novel Revan, but also in the Prima official game guide for Knights of the Old Republic 2. The guide describes it with the cold precision of battlefield machinery. The novel lingers on what that machinery cost. Revan built the battle as a trap. He split his fleet in two, gave half to Mitra, and kept the rest for himself. While he engaged Mandalore directly, Mitra's fleet would draw the Mandalorians close to the planet and hold them there. The plan only worked if her ships remained in position long enough for the generator to fire. She held her position exactly as ordered, keeping the Mandalorians close enough to seal the trap around Malachor 5. When the generator fired, space itself folded inward, tearing apart every ship in orbit in a single instant. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed there, and most of Mitra's was destroyed with it. The war ended in the same moment thousands of her own people died. Mitra survived, but barely. She had been close enough to the weapon that the shockwave nearly killed her. It left her vulnerable. At the same time, she felt the loss of the Mandalorians and her fellow soldiers through the Force. Every life, every voice, all of them cut off together. For a Jedi, it was beyond pain, because nothing in their training had prepared them to feel that many lives vanish at once. It became a wound her teachings could not contain, and with no way to endure it, she protected herself the only way she knew how. She cut herself off from the Force, and for years, it seemed permanent. What the weapon did to the planet was still. Malachor 5 did not simply become a dead world, it became a scar in the Force itself. A wound that would not heal. Any Force-sensitive who came near would feel echoes of unimaginable pain and suffering, the last moments of everyone who had died there repeating in the currents of the Force. Malachor remained a place of extraordinary dread and trauma in the Force. Revan had won his war, but he had won it through a single calculated sacrifice that never stopped shadowing the victory. Years later, after his own memories of the event were gone, he would try to look back on those choices and find that he cannot fully explain or justify them, even to himself. He did not know whether he had understood what would happen. He did not know whether the plan had gone wrong or unfolded exactly as he had intended. The records were sealed after Malachor 5. The mission report was locked away in the Jedi archives under restricted access, and the men and women who had survived returned to a republic that had already decided it did not want to hear what they had endured. Mitra Surik, who had obeyed Revan's orders and paid for them more dearly than most, found that there was no place left for her in the world she had fought to save, so she simply walked away. Revan did not come home, and neither did Malak. With the Mandalorians broken, Revan chose to pursue the scattered remnants of their fleet beyond the edge of charted space. Malak went with him, past the Outer Rim, and into the unknown regions where Republic maps simply ended. Officially, they were finishing the war. In reality, they found something else. The two Jedi who had refused Council orders and won a war they were forbidden to fight did not return as heroes. They did not return as Jedi at all. What came back into Republic space were the same ships, but not the same men. Revan wore a different mask and carried a different title. So did Malak. They were called Darth now. When the Council finally offered an official explanation, they gave one that placed the blame on the ancient power of a Rakatan superweapon, a relic of a long-dead empire known as the Starforge. It had been in the unknown regions, they said, and it had bent the two men to its will. That was the version passed on to the Republic's historians. Even years later, Revan never fully accepted that explanation, because too much of what had happened to him remained hidden behind gaps in his own memory. He suspected there was more. He could not remember what it was. He could only remember that he had feared it on a deep, primal level. Something he had seen out there that was greater than the Mandalorians, greater than the Starforge, greater than anything the galaxy had yet faced. Whatever he had found, he came back to burn the Republic he had just saved. The Sith War that followed cost millions of lives, as the armies Revan had once built to protect the Outer Rim were turned against the Republic itself, and because of that, worlds fell and fleets burned. Cities that had hung his portrait as a liberator learned that the man in the portrait was now the one ordering them shelled. At his side stood Malak, no longer friend or student alone, but apprentice. For the Jedi, that new war did not erase the old one. Masters who had once resented Revan for leading thousands of their own to die in the Mandalorian Wars now watched him kill Republic soldiers and civilians by the million. The grievances piled on top of one another until none could be separated from the rest, and because of that, no single framing could contain him. He was, by turns, traitor and conqueror, apostate and emperor. Because the Republic somehow held on long enough, the Jedi were able to rally, and eventually, by means the Republic would never fully learn, the war against Darth Revan ended not in defeat on the battlefield, but with a strike team that managed, against long odds, to take the Dark Lord alive. What happened to Revan after his capture was not written into any ceremony. They saved Revan's life, but only by stripping his memories. Reaching into him through the Force, they took away the man he had been, then began rebuilding what remained. What they shaped was not the Revan who had defied them, and not the Darth who had burned Republic worlds, but a new man carrying pieces of both. And because Malak had already betrayed his master, fired on his flagship, and seized the remnant Sith Empire for himself, the Council suddenly had a use for Revan. They aimed him at the apprentice he had once trained, so they sent him out under the guidance of the young Jedi, Bastila Shan, and a small handful of companions, with the task of finding and killing Malak. For a time, the Council's gamble paid off. They rebuilt Revan, unaware for most of his journey of who he really was, hunted Malak across the galaxy. In doing so, he ended the Second War and saved the Republic a second time. But the deeper the hunt went, the more the old self began to return. His memories resurfaced in fragments, until by the time he faced Malak at the Starforge, he understood the truth completely. He knew that the hand the Council had raised against Malak was the same hand that had once raised Malak himself. He fought his apprentice and killed him anyway. The weapon the Council had forged recognized itself. When it was over, Revan returned to Coruscant as something the Jedi had no clear place for. To the Republic, the story was simple. The Senate awarded him the Cross of Glory, the highest honor it could give, and the ceremony was broadcast across the HoloNet. Across known space, people heard the same message. Revan had saved the Republic twice. But inside the temple, the truth was far less settled. Publicly, he had been redeemed and restored to the light. Privately, many masters did not believe redemption could erase what he had once become. The Council could give him a place in the public record. Within the Order, they still did not know what to call him. That uncertainty only deepened in the 2 years that followed, because during that time, Revan married Bastila. By Jedi standards, it was quiet, but it still broke doctrine outright. And to Revan, the marriage mattered for more than personal reasons. Bastila had been the one who found him, and during their hunt for Malak, she had briefly fallen to the dark side herself. Yet it had been his love that brought her back. Their bond had saved them both. To Revan, that made attachment more than emotion. It made it evidence that the Jedi had misunderstood something fundamental. By then, he had lived through both extremes of the Force. He had served the light completely, and he had fallen fully into the dark. He knew what it meant to deny emotion, and he knew what it meant to be consumed by it. Because he had known both, he came to believe that Jedi and Sith doctrine were flawed in the same way. To suppress emotion entirely was a fool's game. Jealousy was not simply evil waiting inside the soul. More often, it was what happened when a Jedi was taught to deny feeling instead of understanding it. From that, Revan drew a conclusion the Council could never have accepted. Love, loyalty, and happiness could strengthen a Jedi's bond to the Force, just as anger and hatred fed the dark side. So he brought that belief to the Council openly. He asked for a meeting and offered to share what he thought he had learned. What he received was not a debate, but hostility. Some masters wanted him banished outright. Others stopped short of that, not because they trusted him, but because they understood his legend was too useful to destroy. So they chose a colder compromise. Revan could remain within the Order, but only in silence. He He could keep his place, his name, and his life in the temple, so long as he never taught what he had learned. The truth of what the Jedi had done to him was erased almost as completely as the man he had once been. The galaxy kept the legend because that was the version the Council allowed to survive. The truth stayed inside the temple, sealed away, with everything else that no longer fit the story. Around that same time, Meetra Surik returned after years of wandering, cut off from the Force and from the order she had once followed into war. The Council did not welcome her back. Instead, they banished her. Atris, who had once been close to her, helped explain why. Meetra was no longer just a former Jedi, she had become a symbol of everyone who had defied the Council's will during the Mandalorian Wars. And once someone became a symbol, the Council no longer judged them as an individual. Mercy gave way to example, so Meetra was exiled, while Revan, the man who had led her into that war, was allowed to remain. It was a strange kind of arithmetic, but it reveals something more important about how the Council thought. Revan was dangerous, but still useful. Meetra represented disobedience itself, and symbols like that had to be pushed outside the walls. Revan noticed, and what happened to Meetra no longer looked like a single injustice. It looked like part of a larger pattern. The Council moved first against anything that threatened its authority, and that made him look again at the thing he had once encountered in the unknown regions. His memory of it had been damaged, but the fear had survived. It was still there, buried so deeply that it no longer needed clear shape or explanation. He knew with a certainty deeper than reason that what he had found beyond the edge of known space was worse than anything the Council had ever imagined, and he became convinced it was still waiting. He tried to warn others, but by then, he already knew what the Council would do. Even his allies spoke of it with a kind of weary certainty, as though the outcome had already been decided. They would say it almost without thinking, even if the Jedi Council refused to act again. And that word mattered, because it meant this was no longer a fear or a suspicion. The Council had begun noticing a pattern of its own. Bastila refused to return for retraining after everything she had endured, and some masters saw in that refusal the same danger they saw in Revan himself. Another gifted Jedi drifting away from accepted doctrine. One exception had already caused enough damage. A second was intolerable, so Revan chose his companions carefully. He did not rely on the Jedi who still answered to the temple. He gathered people loyal to him, not the Council. Meetra came with him, her bond to the Force restored more deeply than she had believed possible. Together, they went into the unknown regions. For Revan, it was the second time he had crossed into that darkness. The first time, he had returned as a Sith Lord. This time, he said nothing to the Council at all. What they found began with Nathema, a dead world erased from charts and history by the Sith Emperor himself. Meetra felt the truth of it first. Malachor had screamed in the Force. Nathema did not scream at all. It was simply empty, a void so complete that it revealed the truth at once. Revan and Malak had not been turned by the Starforge. They had come here, seen what the Emperor could do, and knelt. What Nathema exposed was far worse than the Jedi had ever understood. The story told in the temple that Revan and Malak had been corrupted by the Starforge was not the truth, or not the whole of it. They had seen what was waiting in the dark beyond the Republic, and once Revan understood that, he pressed further. He crossed from the unknown regions into the hidden worlds of the Sith Empire itself, a civilization the Republic did not know existed, ruled by an immortal emperor whose name the Republic had never even heard. Once he understood what was waiting out there, he went after the Emperor directly. That choice led him into the Emperor's own throne chamber. Revan had come to end him, and he had brought allies because he knew no one reached that far alone. There, he fought with everything he had learned across 2 lifetimes of Force use. At the height of the battle, when the Emperor reached into his mind the same way the Jedi had years before, Revan answered with something no doctrine had prepared him to do. Because neither side alone was enough, he did not choose one. Instead of simply pressing forward, he opened himself to the Force and let both light and dark run through him like twin rushing rivers. He did not focus it or channel it, he released it in its purest form. It kept him alive. It did not win, and because he was taken alive, Revan was placed in a suspended cage of shimmering power, hanging somewhere between life and death. For however many centuries his body survived in stasis, Revan would fight back in the only way he still could, with his mind, against the mind of the thing that held him. He held on to that purpose to survive. If he could delay the Emperor's invasion of the Republic by 50 years, then Bastila might never have to endure the horrors of another galactic war. That was the measure and the goal, and while he fought for it in the dark, no one in the galaxy behind him knew where he was. The Jedi Council knew least of all. Because they knew nothing of what he had found, they understood nothing of what had happened. They did not know where Revan had gone. They did not know that Mitra had died in the same campaign. They did not know the name of the Sith Emperor, did not know he existed, did not know he had waited for centuries to march into the Republic. They knew only that Revan had disappeared, that he had broken his promise, and that he was gone. While Revan hung in his cage beyond the edge of the known galaxy, others in the Republic picked up fragments of what he and Malak had brought back from the unknown regions. A woman named Kreia, once a Jedi Master, gathered rogue Jedi around her and turned them toward the dark teachings Malak and Revan had uncovered. She took a new name, Darth Treya, and her followers called themselves the Sith after the long-lost species that had invaded the Republic a millennium before. They began a systematic purge of the galaxy, hunting down those who still held fast to the Jedi Code, killing them by the tens of thousands. The Silence had not protected the Order. The Silence had let the fire spread. Inside the temple, Malachor 5 remained sealed, and because it remained sealed, the mission report stayed buried in a section of the archives that ordinary students could not open. Among the Jedi, it was often said that if a record did not appear in the archive, then it did not exist. That was the principle of their library. In time, it became the principle of their memory too. Bastila lived on after Revan's disappearance. She raised the son they had had together, a boy named Vader. She raised him outside the Order. Vader would never be a Jedi. If he had been, he could never have married the woman he eventually married and would never have become the political leader he became. He grew up instead into a statesman who helped hold the Republic together in the years after the Sith Purge. A Jedi family, broken by Jedi rules, produced one of the men who rebuilt the galaxy. Out in his cage, Revan did exactly what he had set out to do. Year after year, decade after decade, he held his ground. He could not win free, but he could resist, and resistance became delayed. Delay became pressure. Pressure turned the Emperor inward, toward Dromund Kaas, toward the hidden Sith worlds, and towards the fragile order of his own dominion. Whatever plans he had once made for open war against the Republic were pushed back, not for months, but for decades. He bought far more time than he ever knew, and far more than the Republic ever realized it had been given. For a while, that was enough to alter the course of events. The attack on the Emperor's throne chamber had not killed him, but it had changed his priorities. The Republic was no longer the prize immediately before him. Instead, he turned his attention inward, toward the hidden machinery of his own empire, toward the worlds he already ruled, and toward the unstable order he could not afford to let fracture. The Jedi Council never knew any of it. Revan's final mission had not been sanctioned, so when he vanished beyond the edge of known space, the Temple had no record that could explain where he had gone or why. They could not prepare later generations for the enemy he had found, because they did not know that enemy existed. To them, Revan had simply disappeared again, as he had before, into a darkness no one in the Order could name. And because they did not know, they said nothing. The silence that had begun as caution hardened over time into custom. One generation of masters passed it on to the next, until omission no longer felt like a decision at all, but like the natural order of things. Padawans came and went, years gave way to centuries, and the answer remained the same. Revan was not discussed in any way that mattered. However, the Council's silence held for centuries. Outside the temple walls, the full story of his life had never disappeared. He was a Jedi who chose to act when the Order refused to move, a general who won the most important war of his era and lost himself in the process, and a figure so dangerous and so necessary that the galaxy still felt his shadow thousands of years after his name was forgotten by most who carried on inside it. He has been called 5 things across his lifetime: hero, traitor, conqueror, villain, and savior. Every one of those names was earned, and this is the story of how. Chapter 1. The Defiant Jedi. The Jedi High Council refused to go to war against the Mandalorians. Revan decided that was not an answer he could accept. The Old Republic, in the centuries before the war against the Mandalorians, was one of the oldest governing powers in galactic history. It had survived major conflicts with the Sith, long periods of rebuilding, and stretches of hard-won peace. The Jedi Order served at the center of that peace, acting as protectors, diplomats, and when the situation demanded it, soldiers. In the years before the war that would define Revan's generation, the Order spent most of its time in the first 2 roles. The Jedi High Council made its decisions carefully and slowly, weighing long-term effects against short-term pressures, because that care had come from hard experience. Wars had a way of lasting longer than the reasons that started them, and the Council had seen enough of those wars to know that rushing into battle created suffering that could carry on for generations. He grew up inside that tradition. The novel describes him as a powerful Jedi Master who rose quickly through the ranks of the Order. Not a slow learner or a careful climber, but the kind of student and then the kind of knight who stood out to those around him naturally. His mind moved fast. His connection to the Force was strong. He understood military planning in a way that most Jedi never had reason to develop, and he thought about the Order's role in the galaxy with a directness that some found impressive and others found troubling. His physical appearance was ordinary in every way. The same novel describes him as an ordinary-looking man with sharp features, pale skin, and shoulder-length black hair. Not the kind of presence that filled a room simply by entering it. What made him stand out was the quality of his thinking and the strength of his beliefs, not anything visible on the surface. His view on emotion was the clearest point of difference between him and the traditional Jedi teaching. The Order believed that strong emotions, especially attachment, were a source of danger. Feeling too deeply for another person could cloud a Jedi's judgment, and love could pull a warrior towards choices that serve personal feelings rather than the greater good. The traditional teaching pushed Jedi to find inner peace by moving past the grip of those emotions, to reach a state of calm that the Council believed produced better and more responsible decisions. He did not reject the idea of self-control entirely, and he accepted that unchecked emotion could cause real harm. But the book makes it clear that he viewed the traditional teaching as a mistake in its most extreme form. Pushing emotion down entirely, treating love and loyalty as weaknesses to be managed and suppressed, was, in his view, a foolish approach that weakened rather than strengthened a Jedi. He believed that positive emotions, love, the desire to protect those you cared about, loyalty to people worth being loyal to, could actually strengthen a Jedi's connection to the Force. They were not threats to be contained, they were sources of strength when understood and used correctly. That position did not win him many arguments in council chambers, but it was one he held without wavering, and it would shape every major choice he made for the rest of his life. Alongside him through this early period was Malak, his closest companion in the Order and, by any reasonable measure, his best friend. Malak was also a capable Jedi Knight, also growing frustrated with the Council's careful approach to the problems spreading across the galaxy, and also watching the same crisis unfold in the far outer territories with growing alarm. The two of them shared not just a philosophy, but a way of looking at the Order's purpose, that being a Jedi meant active protection rather than careful observation, and that there were moments when waiting for the right conditions was itself a kind of failure. The Mandalorian threat was one of those moments. The Mandalorians had been part of galactic history long before he was born, a warrior culture built around clans, guided by codes of combat and honor, and defined by their willingness to fight anyone who offered a real challenge. Under normal conditions, they raided, they challenged, and they occasionally negotiated. In the years before the war against them, however, something shifted in how they operated. Their attacks became more organized, more purposeful, and more deeply damaging to the systems they targeted. The far outer territories, never the most well-defended part of the Republic, began to fall sector by sector. Populations were driven from their homes. Republic forces, spread across an enormous area with too few soldiers, could not respond fast enough to protect the people being targeted. Requests for Jedi involvement reached Coruscant regularly, and the Council received them, considered them, and declined to act. The reasons were not fully public. Some members believed the conflict was pulling attention away from a deeper darkness they sensed growing at the edges of the Force. Some held to the principle that large-scale Jedi involvement in military campaigns had historically led to results worse than the conflicts they were meant to stop. Some may have believed, with hindsight wrongly, that the Mandalorian advance would slow on its own before reaching the Republic's core systems. Whatever their individual reasons, the result was the same. The Outer Territories suffered while the Order watched from a distance, and entire systems fell while the Council deliberated. For Revan, that distance was something he cannot accept and could not make peace with. He understood the Council's arguments and was not dismissive of the traditions he had grown up inside or the hard-earned wisdom those traditions contained. But he looked at the evidence in front of him and reached a different conclusion. The Jedi Order existed to protect people. They had the ability to act. Choosing not to use that ability in the face of a documented and growing threat was not caution. It was stepping away from the Order's most basic purpose. He made his case through proper channels, requested meetings, and brought the information coming out of the Outer Territories to the Council's attention repeatedly, asking them to reconsider their position. The Council held its position each time. At some point, he stopped asking and started organizing. He and his oldest companion began reaching out to other Jedi, those who shared the view that staying out of the fight while whole systems burned was impossible to defend. This was not a quick or simple process. The Council had authority and tradition on its side, and many Jedi trusted the Council's judgment because that Council had guided the Order through hard times before. He had to make the case not just that he was right, but that the Council was wrong, and that acting without their approval was the right and necessary thing to do. He was persuasive in a way that few people ever manage, not simply presenting facts, but giving people a genuine reason to move. He offered a clear picture of what was happening, what it would continue to cost if nothing changed, and why the traditional arguments for staying back were failing the people the Order was supposed to protect. He made the case that there are times when an organization's own care for its principles causes harm by applying them too rigidly, and that this was one of those times. Some Jedi refused to hear it, others were convinced. Enough were moved to make a real difference. Among those who joined them was Mitra Surik, who would later become known as the Exile. As detailed in the book, it identifies her as one of his most trusted generals, a Jedi with strong personal instincts and the ability to run complex operations under pressure. Her presence was not symbolic or ceremonial. She handled responsibilities that would have stretched any standard military officer to their limits, and she became essential to how the campaign operated at every level. The Republic's response to his decision mixed relief with deep unease. The military had been struggling. The Mandalorian advances were not slowing, and there was no sign that they would stop at the Outer Territories. The arrival of Jedi-led forces, organized and directed in ways that conventional Republican units were not built to replicate, changed the shape of the campaign almost immediately. Revan did not show up to support the Republic's existing approach to the problem. He replaced it with his own, and he had the results to justify that move within a short period. His early victories were real, visible, and undeniable. The Jedi who followed him trusted his decisions in the field. Republic soldiers who served alongside him respected his leadership, and the Mandalorians, who had come to expect a certain level of disorder in the Republic's response, found themselves facing something different, an opponent who studied them, anticipated their movements, and refused to be easy to read or predict. That discipline, the refusal to treat a dangerous enemy as simply violent and disorganized, was one of his greatest strengths as a leader. He learned the Mandalorian culture, their codes of honor, their expectations in battle, and the cultural rules that shaped how they made decisions on and off the battlefield. He understood that to defeat them at a strategic level, he had to think the way they thought, and then find where that thinking broke down under pressure. That approach produced results, but it also required him to make decisions that went beyond ordinary and military planning. The Mandalorians fought to win without limits, and matching them meant being willing to operate the same way. This was where the war began to cost him something beyond lives and resources. The Jedi tradition asked its followers to weigh every action against its wider effects, to seek peace where possible, and to choose mercy where the situation allowed. He had not abandoned those values when he left Coruscant, but the campaign tested them constantly. There were situations where the choice that would protect the most people in the short term was not the choice those values would have recommended, and he made those decisions and accepted the cost, telling himself each time that he had to. The war spread, and he spread with it. The conflict consumed years. The Outer Territories, which had been the starting point, were only the beginning. The Mandalorians adjusted to his tactics, rebuilt where they took losses, and pushed in directions he had to scramble to address. The scope of the conflict expanded around him, and he took on the full role of top military commander of the Republic's combined forces. Not simply the leader of a Jedi detachment, but the person responsible for everything. He was not yet what history would call a Sith Lord. He was a Jedi who had made a choice and was living with the growing weight of it. But the man who entered the war against the Mandalorians, believing in decisive action and the duty to protect, was being changed by the experience of carrying that belief out at an enormous and unforgiving scale. War changes the people who fight it, and it changes the people who lead it most of all. The Council had been placed in a position it had not chosen by a man it cannot easily call back. The tension between the young commander and the Order's leadership did not resolve during the war. It simply sat unaddressed, while more immediate problems demanded everyone's attention. The Jedi who stayed behind watched what was unfolding in the outer territories and felt the darkness growing rather than shrinking. Something at the edges of the conflict that was wrong in ways that went beyond standard military aggression. The Force itself seemed to push back against what was happening, and whether that was a warning about the Mandalorians or about something else entirely was not yet clear. Revan, in the field and focused on winning, was not in a position to examine that feeling carefully. He had a war to finish, and he had a plan to do exactly that. What that plan would cost, and what he would find at the war's end, were things he could not yet see. He won the war against the Mandalorians, but what he found at its end would change him forever. Chapter 2: The Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorian advance did not stop on its own, but Revan stopped it. By the time he had taken full control of the Republic's forces, the war had already burned through enough years and lives to define a generation. The far outer territories were scarred. Systems that had been working and populated before the conflict were barely holding together, and the Republic's military, while still functioning, was showing the strain of a long campaign against a disciplined enemy that did not fight the way conventional Republic tactics were built to handle. He had not simply slowed the Mandalorian advance, he had changed the nature of the fight entirely. The storyline makes clear that he was a brilliant military leader, a commander whose decisions repeatedly caught his opponents off balance, and whose understanding of both Force abilities and standard military planning gave him options that the Republic officers without Force training could not match. But brilliance in war is not a clean quality. It requires making choices that protect lives in one place by spending them in another, requires using tools that leave lasting damage behind, and requires accepting that winning is a process built piece by piece rather than a single decisive moment. He built victories, and alongside them, he built costs. The Mandalorians were not a simple enemy. Their culture was built on the idea that combat was honorable, that the strongest earned their position through battle, and that defeat against a worthy opponent was not shameful as long as the fight was real and fully committed. They respected power, they respected skill. What they had not encountered in this conflict was an opponent who combined Force abilities with the kind of strategic depth that the Republic's new top commander brought to the campaign. He studied them throughout the war. He came to understand their command structure, their supply lines, their patterns of advance and retreat, and the cultural rules that shaped their behavior on and off the battlefield. This knowledge was not simply interesting to him. He used it to design battles that placed the Mandalorian forces at specific disadvantages, targeting their habits and expectations as much as their numbers. He knew when they would push forward and when they would hold ground. He knew which kinds of challenges they would meet with full aggression and which would cause hesitation. He also knew how to hit them where it hurt most deeply. The Mandalorian clan system meant that individual victories carried meaning beyond their military value. Defeating a commander, taking a significant position, or dealing a serious loss to a prominent clan carried cultural weight that a simple focus on numbers would miss entirely. He understood that layer of the conflict and used it on purpose. His tactics became harder and harsher as the war continued, not through a sudden decision, but through a slow hardening that happens when someone fights a long war and keeps reaching the conclusion that doing more is necessary. He entered the Mandalorian conflict as a Jedi who believed in decisive action. By its midpoint, he was authorizing operations with staggering costs and justifying them as necessary for the overall outcome. The individuals who served under him trusted him. The Republic praised his results. The Jedi Council, watching from Coruscant, felt the darkness around the conflict growing with each passing month and held their concern. Meetra Surik remained one of his most trusted generals throughout this entire period. The novel presents the exile as someone with real and substantial ability, a Jedi he relied on not just because she was skilled, but because she understood his approach well enough to carry out his intentions without needing constant direction. She was working at a level that would mark her own place in history in the years following the war. What neither of them fully understood while fighting was how deeply the experience was changing them both, reshaping their connection to the Force and to the people around them in ways that would take years to fully understand. A pattern Revan had been tracking since the middle of the campaign began to sharpen during the final phases of the war. The Mandalorians had attacked with a level of organization and purpose that seemed too careful and too well targeted to be entirely their own idea. Their advance had focused on specific resources and avoided others in ways that pointed toward outside guidance, something above the clan structure that was shaping the campaign's direction from a distance. He noted these patterns carefully, gathering the pieces, but cannot yet identify their source. The sense that the war was not entirely what it appeared had become something he carried with him into every decision he made. The war's end would bring that feeling into sharp focus in a way that he had not prepared for. The final part of the Mandalorian conflict centered on a direct confrontation with Mandalore the Ultimate, the supreme leader of the Mandalorian clans. Under Mandalorian tradition, this title was more than a military rank. It held cultural weight that organized the entire clan system, gave the warriors their shared identity, and made continued resistance both possible and meaningful. Defeating Mandalorian forces battle after battle was a partial solution at best. Removing Mandalore changed everything at once. The Old Republic, Revan, describes the Republic's chief commander defeating Mandalore the Ultimate in one-on-one combat, and this was not simply a military achievement, though it was undeniably that. In Mandalorian terms, a single combat victory over Mandalore was the kind of act that moved through the entire culture with lasting force. It showed, in terms the Mandalorians recognized and respected above all others, that the victor was stronger. He had not just won the battle, he had proven his superiority in the way Mandalorian tradition understood it best. After the victory, he went further. He took the Mask of Mandalore, the sacred item that gave the title its authority and provided its holder a direct connection to Mandalorian identity and traditions spanning generations. Then, rather than keep it or destroy it, he carried it to the icy world of Rekiat and hid it there. His reasoning was clear and fully planned. Without the mask, there could be no new Mandalore to step into the title. Without a Mandalore to bring the clans together, the clans could not regroup and restart. The surrender that followed was not just a military outcome. By his design, it was something the Mandalorians had no structural way to reverse. He had not simply beaten them in the field, he had removed the very tool they would need to begin again. The Mandalorians surrendered without conditions. The Battle of Malachor V brought the war to its official end, but it did so at a cost that left permanent marks on everyone who was present. Malachor V held a key position in the final campaign, and the battle there became the most damaging engagement of the entire conflict. It was at Malachor V that Meetra Surik activated a gravity-based superweapon of enormous power that used the planet's own gravitational field as a weapon. The device destroyed the Mandalorian fleet while also devastating significant portions of the Republic forces caught in the same radius. The results were not precise in any sense. The weapon did not separate enemies from allies, and what it produced was destruction on a scale that went far beyond anything conventional military action could justify or explain. The battle ended the war. It also destroyed Malachor V and left wounds in the Force that those connected to it could feel from enormous distances. The novel describes the event as something that scarred the Force itself, an act that left a mark not just in the physical world, but in the living energy connecting all things. For the Jedi who survived, the experience caused damage that went beyond physical injury. The Force connection that tied them to the living world had been struck by something immense, and some of them lost that connection entirely in the aftermath. The lasting harm of that battle, or the Jedi who had fought under Revan's leadership, would reshape the next chapter of the Order's history in ways that would not become fully clear for some time. The Republic had been saved, but the cost of that salvation could not be simply measured. With the war over, neither Revan nor his closest companion returned to Coruscant. They did not present themselves to the Republic Senate or to the Jedi Council. Instead, they turned towards the uncharted space at the edge of the galaxy, taking a force of ships with them and a purpose they did not share publicly with anyone. What drove them there was the threat he had been following during the final phase of the war, the growing sense that the Mandalorian campaign had been guided from somewhere outside the clan structure. He had enough pieces of the pattern to believe there was something worth finding out there, something that had used the Mandalorians as a tool and was still intact, still waiting, still dangerous. He was right. He just did not understand what he was walking into. He left behind a Republic grateful for its survival and a Jedi Order deeply troubled by what it had witnessed. He took his closest companion and the ships he commanded and moved into space that most people did not enter by choice. The war was over. What came next had no name yet. He returned from the uncharted edge of the galaxy, but he did not return as a Jedi Knight. Chapter 3: Darth Revan. The uncharted space at the galaxy's edge was not simply an empty region waiting to be mapped. It was a specific kind of darkness, a part of the galaxy where travel routes were unstable, navigation was difficult, and the absence of Republic structure meant that whatever had developed there had done so entirely without contact from the wider civilization. For a man with Revan's sharp mind and his growing uncertainty that something significant had been operating behind the Mandalorian Wars, this unknown entity was not a mystery to avoid. It was a problem that needed to be solved. He and his closest companion moved in with their fleet, following the threads gathered during the campaign. They were looking for the source of the outside influence on the Mandalorian campaign. They found it, and it was far worse than either of them had prepared for. The hidden Sith stronghold was unlike anything in Republic-aligned space. The old Republic Revan describes it as a place covered in constant electrical storms, where the sky itself was violent and the atmosphere carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. The Sith Empire that had built itself in secret had been hiding for a very long time, growing in strength and waiting for the right moment to move against a Republic it had never stopped viewing as an enemy worth destroying. At the center of that empire was the Sith Emperor. His name, as the wider galaxy would eventually come to know it, was Vishet. The same novel provides important details for understanding what made him different from the Sith the Republic and the Jedi had faced in earlier conflicts. He was not simply a powerful dark side user who had risen through the standard Sith system of strength and betrayal. He was something older and far more dangerous. He had achieved a form of lasting life, holding himself together through a connection to the dark side that went far beyond normal Force use. To show his power and feed that immortality, he had drained the Force from his original home world, a planet called Nathema, consuming every living thing on it in a single act. What had once been a living world connected to the Force became an empty shell, stripped of everything that made life possible in a Force sense. Vishet had done this on purpose and had survived it. He had been building his empire and planning his return to the galaxy for centuries. The Mandalorian Wars had been part of that plan, a deliberate move to weaken the Republic and the Jedi before the main invasion arrived. When the two Jedi walked into his territory thinking they were tracking down a threat, they were entering a trap that had been built long before either of them was born. The novel is direct about what the Sith ruler did to them. He was more powerful than either of them, and his ability to take control of other minds was not a simple Force trick, but something he had refined over a very long life and used with terrible precision. When the two Jedi confronted him, he overpowered their mental defenses and seized control of their minds, turning them into instruments of his will and sending them back towards the Republic as the leading force of a Sith invasion. His plan was for them to serve him directly, to use their knowledge of the Republic and their established reputations to prepare the galaxy for conquest. He sent them back to do exactly that work. What he underestimated was the strength of their wills. Both men had been shaped by years of war into something that even the Emperor's mental control cannot fully contain. Their sense of identity was strong enough, their purpose defined enough, that even under his influence, they found a way to push his instructions in a different direction. They blocked out the memories of their time at the Emperor's stronghold. They pushed aside knowledge of the Emperor's existence and his plans. In doing so, they created something the immortal ruler had not intended. Two independent Sith conquerors who answered to no one but themselves. They became Darth Revan and Darth Malak. Revan's longtime friend, who had gone to war alongside him as Alec, took the Sith name Darth Malak and fully committed himself to the conquest they had been sent back to carry out. The man Revan had trusted above all others was now his apprentice in darkness, bound to him by shared purpose and a shared fall. The Republic's greatest heroes had become its greatest threat. This change did not arrive instantly in the wider galaxy. The two Sith Lords did not return from the uncharted regions and announce themselves at once. They came back with their fleet and began building power in an organized way, drawing Republic military forces to their banner, using Revan's established reputation and military authority to bring in recruits. Soldiers and commanders who had served under him during the Mandalorian Wars and trusted his judgment were now being folded into something very different from a Republic campaign. They were becoming a Sith war machine. The book, alongside the KOTOR campaign guide, supports the account of how organized and step-by-step this process was. Darth Revan was not creating disorder, he was building an army with the same careful mind that had won the Mandalorian Wars, now turned towards the destruction rather than the protection of the Republic. He was cold, focused, and working from a plan he followed carefully. At the heart of that plan was the ancient weapons factory built by a long-dead species. The Darth Bane trilogy identifies this installation, known as the Starforge, as a massive orbiting factory built by the Rakata, an ancient species of Force users who had once controlled much of the galaxy. It was not a standard military base, but an artifact powered by dark-side energy, a construction that could produce war material at a rate that normal production could not come close to matching. The fleet it produced carried something of that dark energy within it, making it a weapon in more than one sense. Darth Revan had found this installation during his time in the uncharted regions with his companion, and now it served as the foundation of his military power, producing ships and weapons faster than the Republic could counter. With that foundation in place, the war began. The Republic's reaction to learning that the man who had saved it was now trying to destroy it was the kind of shock that does not clear quickly. These were not unknown enemies emerging from distant and unknown space. These were people the Republic had celebrated, relied on, and in many cases trusted completely with their lives. The name that had meant safety for years now meant the opposite, and the commanders who had followed Darth Revan into this new war had made their decision with full knowledge of what it meant. For everyone else, the scale of the turn was almost too large to absorb. The Jedi Order found itself living with the direct result of its own earlier decisions. The young commander had gone to fight the Mandalorian Wars against the Council's wishes, and now, what he had become in that war was marching on the Republic the Jedi existed to protect. The Council had sensed a darkness tied to the conflict from the beginning. They had been right that something was wrong. They had not been able to stop what came from it. Darth Revan's campaign against the Republic was organized rather than simply destructive. He was not trying to burn everything, he was trying to conquer and control. He used the ancient factory's production capacity to maintain a fleet the Republic struggled to match, and he used his deep knowledge of Republic military practices and defensive positions to strike where the defenses were weakest. He was focused and effective, and the war he was fighting was not a balanced conflict. One side held major advantages, and that side was his. His approach to Force users reflected the same useful logic. He understood the value of Force-sensitive soldiers on his side, and some Jedi fell to the dark side during the war while others were captured and turned. The conflict added capable dark side warriors to his forces at a steady pace, building on what the ancient factory was already providing in military equipment and ships. Malak fought beside him, committed and effective throughout this period. Their relationship during the war was clearly defined. Darth Revan was the master, his former friend the student and subordinate. The former companion was powerful and capable, but he operated within the structure the Dark Lord had set. There was no visible sign of what was building inside him, no outward warning of what was coming. There rarely is until the moment arrives. What was developing beneath the surface in the subordinate's thinking was a growing ambition that the Dark Lord had not fully noticed. Malak was not satisfied with the role he had been given. He had watched his master operate at the highest level through both the Mandalorian Wars and the current conflict, and he had learned from every part of it. He had also been watching for a moment when the balance of power between them might shift in his favor, waiting for an opening that he could use. Meanwhile, the Jedi were not simply absorbing the damage, they were working on a response, and that response would come in a form neither Sith Lord fully expected. Malak turned on his master in the middle of battle, and in doing so, changed the direction of galactic history. Chapter 4: Betrayal. Being turned on by someone trusted completely is not simply a setback in battle. It is a break in the structure of everything a person has built their understanding of the world on. For the Dark Lord, who had organized the entire war around his own vision and turned the greatest military effort of his era towards a goal shaped entirely by his own will, his former companions' move against him was exactly that kind of break, and it came at a moment when there was no time to process it. During a battle with a Jedi strike team, Malak made his move. He ordered his own ships to open fire on his master's flagship, and while the strike did not kill the Dark Lord outright, it was damaging enough to destroy his physical state and leave him open in a way that the Jedi boarding party could use. The strike team, led by a Jedi named Bastila Shan, found him alive, but barely so. What the Jedi Council chose to do next was one of the most important and most troubling decisions made in this entire era. They chose not to let him die. They chose something far more complicated. Chapter 5: Memory Wiped. Bastila Shan was not a standard Jedi warrior. She possessed a rare force ability called Battle Meditation, which allowed her to support the focus and coordination of allied forces across large distances while at the same time weakening the drive and effectiveness of enemy units. A power that had been one of the key reasons the Republic had survived the war to that point. She had also, in the moments after the Dark Lord was struck down and before he was entirely lost, formed a shared force connection with him, something that was not planned and that carried effects no one had fully anticipated. That unplanned connection kept him alive when he should have died. In the critical moments after Malak's strike, Bastila reached out through it, using a telepathic stasis link to project life-saving energy into Revan even as he was falling, holding his life together long enough for the boarding party to bring him in. Without that intervention, the Jedi Civil War would have ended differently, and not in the Republic's favor. When the Council received him, they faced a choice that had no clean answer. Executing him was the simplest path. A Sith Lord in their custody, responsible for a war that had killed thousands, could have been put down and the matter closed. Some within the Order may have argued exactly that. The man they held was the most dangerous enemy the Republic had faced in generations. A Sith Lord who had built an invasion and came close to destroying everything the Republic was. He was also, through Bastila's force connection, linked to one of the Order's most valuable assets, and he was potentially the only person with enough knowledge of his own campaign to help end it. The Order's leaders chose a riskier path. Rather than execute him as the Sith Lord he was, they decided to wipe his memory completely, removing everything that made him Darth Revan and rebuilding his identity from the ground up. It was not a clean solution, it was a gamble, and everyone in that room knew it. The Old Republic Revan is honest about how unusual this decision was. Removing a person's memories is not a standard Jedi operation, and it raises serious questions about consent, identity, and the ethics of using another person as a tool. The Council justified it on the grounds of necessity. The war was still ongoing. The ancient weapons factory was still producing the fleet that threatened the Republic. The former Dark Lord, even as a prisoner, remained dangerous if his Sith identity stayed intact. Redirected, however, he could become the key to finding and destroying the factory that powered his former army. They built a false identity around a new purpose. The person who came out of the Council's work was not Darth Revan. He was a Republic soldier with no memory of who he had been, given a new background and a new set of apparent experiences that felt real because they had been placed directly into his mind. He did not know he was the Sith Lord who had led the war. He did not remember the Mandalorian Wars as their top commander. He did not remember Droman Koss or Vishet or the choice he and his former companion had made to become the enemy of everything they had once protected. He was, from all outward appearances, an ordinary person who happened to be connected to the Force. This rebuilt identity was placed aboard the Endar Spire, a Republic vessel sent as part of the continuing effort against the forces Malak now commanded. The plan was to put him near the search for the ancient weapons factory through the young Force ability Jedi, whose shared connection with him was believed to carry traces of his buried knowledge that could be carefully guided, drawing out what was needed without triggering the memories the Council had buried. What no one was fully prepared for was how those memories would begin to surface on their own. The Force has a way of returning people to what they are, not all at once, but in pieces. Bastila Shan was still present throughout this period as his companion, and the bond between them was not simply a mission resource, but something the novel treats as genuine and real. It complicated both their positions in ways neither of them had been prepared for. She had been given instructions to treat her companion as a tool to be used against his former ally. The reality of spending time with him, of experiencing through their shared force connection what he was actually like, was far more complicated than those instructions allowed for. For his part, certain things came to him with unusual ease. Strategy, combat, the ability to read situations and people quickly. These were not simply natural talents rising from nowhere, they were the marks of who he had truly been, coming through the buried memories and fragments and impressions he did not fully understand but could act on. He adjusted quickly to every situation he encountered. He formed real connections with the people around him. He made decisions that were, when examined later, entirely consistent with both his light side values and his practical, sharp thinking. He was moving back towards himself without knowing that was what was happening. Throughout this period, the war continued with Malak as its new leader. The former companion, now the unchallenged ruler of the Sith forces, pressed the campaign with a version of his master's original strategy, but with less precision and more destruction. He lacked the Dark Lord's discipline and focus. His campaign was effective in terms of raw power, but burned more than it needed to, and the Republic was still under enormous pressure as a result. Bastila's capture by the new Sith ruler was one of the most damaging developments of this phase of the war. Malak understood the value of her force ability and worked to break her. He had some success. She was pushed towards the dark side while in his hands, a process that her own doubts and internal pressures made possible in ways that a more settled Jedi might have resisted more completely. She was not simply overpowered, she had real internal struggles that he was able to work with and exploit, and the experience damaged her in ways that would matter greatly when the final confrontation arrived. For a man carrying a false identity, her capture was both a mission priority and something more personal that the force connection between them made impossible to completely set aside. He had to find her, he had to stop the former companion, and he was, by this point, getting closer to understanding who he actually was and what had truly happened to him. Then, the full truth of his identity came back to him. The discovery that the person the Republic had sent to fight Darth Revan was Darth Revan landed with a weight that the careful construction of the memory removal could not fully absorb. He had been getting through fragments of the old memories throughout the search, pieces that arrived without context and without the full picture, but the complete knowledge, the clear and full understanding of what he had been and what he had done was something different from those fragments. It required him to decide, directly and without the opinion of delay, who he was going to be now that he knew the truth. The Council's gamble, that removing his Sith identity would leave behind a person capable of choosing differently, was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Chapter 6: Starforge. The moment of full truth was not, by the account that the Old Republic Revan preserves, a moment of collapse or breakdown. He did not fall apart when the complete picture of his past became clear. He took it in, sat with it, and processed the knowledge that the Sith Lord he had been sent to stop was him, that the destruction of the war was the result of decisions he had made, and that the identity the Council had placed in his mind was a built replacement for something they had been afraid to leave intact. What he did with that knowledge said more about who he truly was than anything that had come before it. He chose the light side. This is the accepted outcome within Legends continuity, and the novel treats it not as a simple or easy choice, but as an act that required real effort and real commitment. The memories of Darth Revan were not sealed away forever, they were returning. The dark side way of thinking he had held, the belief in power as an end in itself, the willingness to use people as instruments, the acceptance that force was the answer to any problem, was not simply gone from him. It was something he had to look at directly and decide to walk away from, knowing it was there and choosing something else over it. What he found when he looked at who he had been was not someone he wanted to become again. The positive emotions he had always believed in, love, loyalty, the desire to protect those he cared about, the things the traditional Jedi Code treated as dangers to be managed, turned out to be exactly what the novel says they were, the foundation that gave him something real to return to. He had people he genuinely cared about. He had Bastila, who had been pushed towards the dark side and needed to be reached. He had a sense that the Republic he had fought to protect in the Mandalorian Wars was worth protecting again, even knowing what he had done to it. These were not abstract ideas, they were the specific and personal content of his choice. he also had work to do immediately. Bastila had been pushed towards the dark side while in the former companion's hands, and she was now at the ancient weapons factory, using her unique force ability for the enemy that she had once opposed. Getting to her and getting through her was the immediate problem standing between him and the war's end. The ancient factory itself was not simply a military base. As the Darth Bane series records from the knowledge store Revan would later leave behind, the Rakata construction was powered by dark side energy and drew on that energy to fuel its endless production. Being inside it, surrounded by that dark force, was not a neutral experience. It pushed whatever the person brought to it in a stronger direction. For someone already tipping towards darkness, it was a force towards worse. For someone committed to the light, it was a constant and exhausting test of that commitment. The assault on the facility required coordination between the forces fighting alongside him and the Republic fleet in the space above the planet. The former companion's war machine was still active and defending the installation, and the battle in space was a necessary condition for getting inside and reaching what waited there. The Republic, worn down but still fighting, provided that outer battle while the redeemed warrior moved through the factory itself. Instead, he found Bastila. The encounter with the young Jedi was not a straightforward fight. She had turned, but not completely, and the force connection between them was still present and real, something that cannot simply be switched off by what had been done to her. He understood that what she needed was not to be defeated in combat. Bastila confronted him directly, pleading with him to come back to the light, her lightsaber drawn and ready if he refused to listen. She was prepared to fight him if that was what it took. He did not make her. Standing at the center of the ancient factory, surrounded by the same dark energy that had once helped him turn into Darth Revan, he chose the light side anyway. The person she had reached through the Force connection during the war, the person she had come to know beneath the false identity the Council had built, was still there and chose to stay. The novel indicates that he succeeded. Her return from the dark side was not a simple reversal or a quick fix. It required her to make the same kind of choice he had just made, to hold on to what she actually valued, rather than surrender to what the dark side was offering her. She had been pushed towards it by real internal struggles and real fears, and coming back from it was not painless or clean, but she came back. With Bastila returned to herself, the path to the former companion was open. Malak was waiting. He'd always known this confrontation would come, because he had made it certain the moment he ordered the strike on his master's flagship. What he had not fully considered was which version of his old master would arrive to face him. The man who had turned against the one he served expected to meet the darkness he knew and had once followed. What he found instead was something he was far less prepared for. The redeemed warrior had to earn his victory. The fight drew on everything Revan was. His combat ability developed over years of war and conflict. His sharp thinking, which even in single combat gave him a way of reading an opponent several moves ahead. His connection to the light side, which the dark energy saturated environment of the ancient factory was constantly pressing against, and his will. The same quality that had allowed both him and his former companion to resist the Sith Emperor's complete control years before at the Emperor's stronghold, now holding him firmly to the choice he had made. Malak fell. The ancient weapons factory, without its main defender and with the Republic fleet pressing the outer battle, was destroyed. The Sith war machine that had pushed the Republic to the edge of destruction broke apart. The war was not fully over in that single moment, since the remaining forces would take time to deal with, but the decisive blow had been struck. The threat that had defined the entire conflict was gone. The redeemed warrior was awarded the Republic's highest military honor in a ceremony that recognized what he had accomplished. The man who had been the Republic's greatest enemy had become, in the end, its savior. The Jedi Council, which had gambled the galaxy on the decision to remove his Sith memories and redirect him as a weapon against his former companion, had its gamble pay off. It was not a clean or straightforward victory. Too much had been lost, too many lives spent on both sides of the war, for celebration to come without weight. But the Republic survived. Bastila survived. The redeemed warrior survived. Even restored to the light, he knew the real Sith threat still waited in the uncharted regions of the galaxy. His full memories were returning now, not just the built identity the Council had placed in his mind, and not just the fragments that had surfaced during the mission. The deeper memories, the one that went back to Dromund Kaas, and the confrontation with the immortal Sith ruler, were coming back with full force. He remembered the Emperor. He remembered what had been done to him and his former companion. He remembered with growing and undeniable clarity that the hidden Sith Empire had not been destroyed when Malak died. It was still out there. Vishet was still out there. The War of the Galaxy had just celebrated ending was not the real war. It was a first move, an opening play, and the Republic had survived it through a combination of effort and something close to luck. The actual invasion was still being planned, still being held back by whatever timing Vishet was working from. The Redeemed Jedi was one of the very few people alive who understood this fully, and that knowledge would not let him rest. He chose not to ignore what he knew. Chapter 7: Prison of Vishet. 2 years after his redemption, the man who had once been Darth Revan was living on Coruscant with Bastila Shan, the young Jedi whose shared Force connection had kept him alive after Malak's strike and who had found her way back from the dark side inside the ancient factory. They had married, an act that reflected both the depth of what existed between them and his long-held belief that love was not the enemy the traditional Jedi teaching made it out to be. They had a son, Vader Shan. On the surface, it looked like the life of a man who had survived something terrible and found his way to something worth protecting. Underneath that surface, something was wrong. The old Republic Revan is clear and direct about this. He was haunted by visions of a storm coming, images he cannot fully explain or dismiss as ordinary anxiety or leftover damage from years of combat. They were, in the way Force visions sometimes are, true in a way the waking mind struggles to carry without acting on them. The storm he was seeing in those visions was real. It was the Sith Empire, still building in the uncharted regions, still waiting, still a threat that he alone among the people around him fully understood in its real dimensions. Those visions would not let him rest. Eventually, they drove him to act. The first step came from the Mask of Mandalore. During the war against the Mandalorians, Revan had hidden it on the icy world of Rekiad to keep the clans from coming together under a new leader. That had been a useful long-term move. Now, living on Coruscant 2 years after the war's end, pieces of memory from his time on Dromund Kaas were pulling at him, and the mask had become part of the thread he needed to pull to restore what was still missing from his understanding of events. He recruited Canderous Ordo, the Mandalorian warrior who had been part of his crew during the hunt for the ancient factory, for a journey to Rekiad to recover the mask. The old Mandalorian soldier had his own reasons for wanting it. Without a Mandalore to lead them, the clans had been broken and without clear direction since the war's end. Revan's purpose was different. He needed the mask to restore the memories that were still incomplete, to fill in the remaining gaps in what he understood about the outside influence that had pushed the Mandalorian clans to begin their assault on the Republic in the first place. They found the mask on Rekiad, and the recovery went as Revan had planned. Holding the mask again and putting it on restored the full memory of how the Sith Emperor had arranged for the Mandalorian clans to begin their assault on the Republic. The Mandalorian Wars had not simply happened as an independent event, they had been designed. The immortal Sith ruler had used the clans as a tool to weaken the Republic and the Jedi Order before his real attack could begin. And now, Revan had back the full picture of why he had been sent to fight a war that was itself a trap laid for him. The truth behind the Mandalorian Wars was darker than anyone in the Republic knew. His next step was the one that would cost him 3 centuries. He traveled to the Emperor's hidden stronghold in the uncharted regions to look directly at the Empire he knew was still growing in secret. He went with T3M4, the navigation and repair droid that had been part of his crew during the search for the ancient factory and that carried encoded messages meant to reach Bastila and the Jedi if he did not return from this journey. He also, as events developed, ended up working alongside Mitra Surik, who had been one of his most trusted generals during the Mandalorian Wars, and who had her own deep and unresolved history with that conflict and its aftermath. There, he was captured. The one who took him was Darth Nihris, a member of the Emperor's inner Sith ruling council. She did not kill him. She held him in a dungeon beneath her compound in conditions carefully designed to cut off his ability to use the Force. The novel describes his time there as 3 years of captivity, during which he was kept under the effect of drugs meant to block his Force connection. Kept isolated, kept disoriented, held in a state where his abilities could not help him or protect him. 3 years in a Sith dungeon changes a person in ways that are hard to fully describe. But the former top military commander had something that his captor had seriously underestimated. His will was not something that chemicals in isolation could wear down to nothing. He was the same person who had resisted the mental control of the Sith Emperor well enough to push the Emperor's instructions in a different direction and act on his own. He was the same person who had come back from the dark side when most people who traveled as far as he had never returned. Even in captivity, he held on to himself and waited for a chance that might never come. Mitra Surik was the one who found him. The exile had returned from her own period away from the Order, the years that the aftermath of the war had cost her, and she had tracked the situation to the Emperor's stronghold through a combination of determination and force sensitivity that made her one of the very few people capable of operating safely in that environment. She did not come alone. She came with an ally that the prisoner would not have chosen if given the option, a Sith Lord named Scourge. Lord Scourge was a member of the Sith Order with his own reasons for involvement in the situation. He was not acting from belief in the Republic or any loyalty to the Jedi. He was someone who had looked at the political situation of the Stronghold and concluded that helping to free Revan served his own interests better than the alternatives available to him. His cooperation was real and functionally useful. His reasons were entirely about his own survival and advancement. That combination made him a valuable partner in the short term and a deeply unpredictable one in any larger sense. When the exile and the Sith Lord reached the dungeon and freed the prisoner, the return of his full self was immediate and powerful. The novel describes him putting on his old mask, the red and gray helmet that had become the image history connected to his name, and feeling his complete memory and strength come back at once. He had been reduced for 3 years. When the mask went back on, he was himself again, and he declared himself Revan Reborn. His first act after that declaration was to destroy Darth Nihilus. Turning her own dark side lightning back against her with full control and full force, he ended his captor immediately. She had subjected him to 3 years of imprisonment and had been a significant figure in the Sith structure he needed to take apart. He used her own weapon against her as his answer to what she had done. With that done, the three of them settled on their next move. The goal was the most direct possible solution: kill the Emperor. Vishet was the source of the threat that the former top military commander had spent years trying to address. The architect of the Mandalorian Wars, the origin of what had been done to him and Malak, and the force behind an invasion the Republic had no idea was still coming. Removing him was the only answer that actually solved the problem at its root rather than at its edges. They moved on the Emperor together. The attempt was not a desperate or poorly planned move. Revan was at full strength. The exile had a unique relationship with the Force that made her dangerous in ways the Sith ruler might not have expected, and the Sith Lord's knowledge of the internal structure of the Stronghold gave them access they would otherwise never have been able to reach. Then, Scourge turned against them. The details the novel provides for this are specific and deeply uncomfortable. During the approach to the Emperor, the Sith Lord experienced a vision. He saw that the attempt to kill the immortal ruler would fail, that neither the exile nor the redeemed warrior would be the one to eventually bring Vishet down. He saw a future warrior, someone neither of them was, who would one day be the agent of the Emperor's destruction. Scourge made a calculation. Surviving to wait for that future person was worth more than dying in an attempt that his vision told him would not succeed. He told the Emperor what was coming. Mitra Surik was killed, Revan was captured, and placed in stasis. The Sith Lord's reasoning was not without its own cold logic. He had seen something real, and had acted to protect himself based on it. But the cost of that calculation fell entirely on the people he had come there with. The exile, who had survived the Mandalorian Wars, and her years of exile and the long journey to Dromund Kaas, died because of a decision she had no knowledge of and no chance to prepare for. Revan, who had already lost 3 years to Nihilus' dungeon, lost centuries to what came next. The Sith ruler placed him in stasis and began drawing on his Force energy, using the connection between them to feed his own power across generations. But even inside that prison, the captured warrior was not passive. This is perhaps the most important element of the story that the novel preserves. The Emperor's connection to Revan, the link that allowed Vishet to draw on his strength, ran in both directions. Revan used it. He could not escape through it. He could not overpower the immortal ruler from the inside of a stasis chamber, but he could influence. He worked on the Emperor's fears, amplifying them, feeding the ruler caution and hesitation, turning Vishet's concerns about failure failure and exposure into something more intense and more paralyzing than they would otherwise have been. The effect was that the invasion the Emperor had been building towards for centuries was pushed back in its timing, not stopped, but delayed in ways that gave the Republic more time, more chances, more opportunities to be in a better position to survive what was eventually coming. Revan did this for Bastila, for Vader, for the family that Vishet's stasis had taken him away from. He could not go back to them on Coruscant, but he could protect them from inside the prison that kept him from them, and he chose to spend centuries doing exactly that. After 300 years, he would eventually break free, but he would not emerge whole. Chapter 8. Legacy. Centuries of stasis inside a Sith Emperor's prison do not leave a person whole. The Revan who eventually appeared in the events of the Star Wars The Old Republic storyline was not the same clear and unified figure who had fought the Mandalorian Wars or challenged Vishet directly at the Emperor's stronghold. The dark side energy that the stasis had maintained, drawing on his strength for 300 years, had left marks that went deep into his sense of self. His light and dark aspects had been separated, divided into something that worked almost like two expressions of the same person, each carrying part of what he had been, and neither carrying all of it. This division is the defining feature of the Revan encountered in the Old Republic game and its expanded storylines. He was not simply a hero working his way free of a long imprisonment. He was a figure whose internal conflict had been made real and external by what Vishet had done to him across centuries. The light that had driven his return to the Jedi and his quiet resistance from inside the stasis was real and present. The darkness that had made him Darth Revan, that had organized the Sith war machine and prosecuted the war against the Republic, was also real and present. Neither aspect resolved cleanly into the other, and in some ways, they did not fully come together again. The divided figure was both more dangerous and more open to harm than either half alone. One of the most visible effects of his legacy during this era was the emergence of the Revanites, a secret group within the Sith Empire that organized itself around his teachings and held his name around their identity. The movement was built on genuine respect for what the former Sith Lord represented, but its understanding of him was necessarily limited by what its members actually had access to. They had the outline of his story and the broad points of his philosophy. What they did not have was the full context that gave those positions their actual meaning and weight. The result was a movement that carried his name without being able to fully capture what had made him who he was. The Revanites believed that their founding figure stood above the simple line between Jedi and Sith, that his willingness to draw on both sides of the Force made him a model for something beyond the standard categories. There was truth in that belief. He had genuinely held positions that did not fit neatly into either tradition, but the movement that carried his name simplified that complexity in ways that he would not have recognized as accurate or complete. The confrontation that came on Yavin 4 was the endpoint of this arc. The events that brought the divided figure to Yavin 4 are drawn from the game's expanded storylines, and the shape of the conflict there reflects the central tension that had defined him since the stasis. Whether the dark or light parts of someone who had been both a Jedi and a Sith Lord could come back together, or whether one eventually had to take over. On Yavin 4, that question reached its final answer, the release of his spirit, the moment the storyline presents as the resolution of everything his imprisonment had torn apart was not a defeat. It was, in the way the Force sometimes works in Legends continuity, a completion. The man who had been fighting in one form or another since before the Mandalorian Wars finally stopped fighting. He did not give in to darkness. He did not become something lesser than what he had been. He passed through the end of his physical life into whatever the Force held on the other side of that passage, and the centuries of built-up conflict passed with him. What remained was his legacy, and that legacy was wide enough to shape the galaxy for thousands of years after his death. The mark he left on Sith philosophy was as significant as anything he did in battle. The novel series provides the clearest record of this. The former Sith Lord had left a knowledge-storing Force crystal known as a holocron on the planet Leon, the unknown world where the final battle of the war against the Republic had been fought. That stored record sat on Leon for roughly 3,000 years before the Sith Lord Darth Bane discovered it. What the future Sith Reformer found inside became the foundation for one of the most significant changes in the history of the Sith Order. The stored teachings argue that any Sith Master who trained more than one student at a time was making a serious mistake. The reasoning was direct and grounded in observation. multiple students would eventually come together against their master. This was not a distant theoretical risk. It was the natural result of a system that selected ambition and rewarded the willingness to remove those who stood in the way. The former Sith Lord had understood this and put it down clearly enough that Darth Bane, reading it 3,000 years after the physical death of its author, found it entirely convincing. That argument became the one master, one apprentice rule that the future reformer applied to the entire Sith Order. He reduced it from a large and constantly fighting organization to a single pair at any given time. One master and one apprentice, passing power and knowledge forward through direct succession rather than through open competition. This structure was the model that carried the Sith forward into the era of Darth Sidious and the Galactic Empire. It was the rule that produced Darth Vader. It came through a direct line from thinking done by a man who had lived 3,000 years before it was applied. The man who helped save the Republic also provided the ideas that eventually led to its destruction. The Darth Bane series also records another layer of what the stored teachings contained that makes Revan's contribution to Sith history even more significant. He had understood what the series calls the inescapable reality of the Sith, that their own ambition and internal fighting would always lead to their defeat by a united Jedi Order. This was not a pessimistic view, but a clear-eyed analysis of a pattern he had seen play out repeatedly. The Sith, left to their natural ways, would always destroy themselves from the inside before outside enemies could. What made his knowledge store so valuable to Darth Bane was not just the one master, one apprentice rule. It was the understanding of why that rule was the only way the Sith could survive long enough to eventually win. Revan had seen the inescapable problem clearly and had worked out the solution. He had also authored a written volume titled The Rakata and the Unknown World, preserving his knowledge of the ancient species and their factory for those who came after him. Beyond the stored knowledge record, the other philosophical content the series records shows the full range of what the former Sith Lord had developed during his time as Darth Revan. His teachings said that the dark side offers more power as an end in itself, that one must take hold of it without holding back, and that mercy, compassion, and loyalty are ideas that stop a person from reaching their full potential. The Sith must be led by a single strong figure, and if that figure grows weak, they must be replaced by someone stronger. One of the most remembered sayings from the stored record was that honor is a fool's prize, and glory is of no use to the dead. Another was that through victory, chains are broken. These were the teachings of Darth Revan, the dark side version of a man who had also believed in protecting people and in the real strength of positive emotion. These two positions are not entirely opposite. They're the product of someone who understood power deeply and from both sides, who had lived the full range of what the Force could lead a person towards. The stored knowledge preserved the dark side version of that understanding. The light side version had played out in his choices at the ancient factory and in the stasis chamber, in the way he spent centuries quietly delaying an invasion to protect the family he could no longer reach. Both versions shaped what came after him. His descendants carried his legacy into the future in ways he could not have imagined when he was living on Coruscant with Bastila and Vaynor. The narrative traces the line from Revan and Bastila through their son Vaynor Shan, the child the imprisoned warrior had worked for centuries to protect, forward through generations to two figures who shaped the Old Republic era in their own right. Theron Shan, the former Sith Lord's descendant and the son of Grand Master Satil Shan and Republic's supreme military leader Jace Malcolm, was not sensitive to the Force. He was, however, a senior field agent for the Republic's intelligence service, described in the novel as highly intelligent, quick to adapt, and deeply practical in his approach to impossible situations. The same qualities that had defined Revan's approach to planning and action showed up, without the Force, in his descendant's career as a Republic spy, operating in the most dangerous circumstances the era produced. Theron's most notable mission, as recorded in the Old Republic Annihilation, was Operation Endgame, a mission he undertook alongside Master Nostoral, a Jedi Master who served as the Republic's top expert on the Sith and as the keeper of the Jedi archives. Nostoral had spent his career studying the Sith Empire, building the most complete picture available to the Republic of how the Empire operated, how it thought, and what it was planning. Together, the intelligence agent and the Jedi historian partnered to destroy the Ascendant Spear, a Sith prototype warship of exceptional power that represented a serious threat to the Republic's ability to defend itself. Their success in Operation Endgame was a direct result of the combination of Theron's field skills and Nostoral's deep knowledge of the enemy they were fighting. The presence of both these figures in the same era, shaped by these same institutions and the same ongoing conflict, was in its own way a continuation of what Revan had started. The Republic they were protecting was the same Republic he had fought to save thousands of years before. The Sith Empire they were working against was the same one that had captured and imprisoned him. His descendants were carrying forward the same fight in a later chapter of the same war. Satele Shan carried more than just Revan's blood. She carried the tension of his philosophy in her own life. The novel presents the Grand Master as a defining figure of the Jedi Order during this era. Someone who led the Jedi through one of their most difficult periods, with a level of ability and commitment that earned her the respect of both Jedi and Republic military. She had defeated the Sith Lord Darth Malgus at the Battle of Alderaan. She guided the Order through the Cold War and the return of the Sith Empire with a steady hand and a clear sense of purpose. She also lived by the Jedi teaching most directly connected to her ancestors' central disagreement with the Order. The same novel records that she followed the Jedi mantra strictly: there is no emotion, there is peace. She pushed aside the emotional connections that could have pulled her towards choices driven by personal feeling rather than a Jedi's wider responsibility. The clearest example of this was her decision to give up her son Theron to be raised by her mentor, Master Ngani Zhou, rather than raise him herself. She feared that her love for the child could push her towards choices that served her personal feelings rather than the people she was responsible for protecting. She followed the Jedi Code in that decision. She also felt the weight of it for the rest of her life. The echo of Revan and his descendants' experience is not simply interesting as a family story. It reflects something true about what his legacy meant in practice across generations. His argument that love and positive emotion could strengthen a Jedi rather than weaken them was not simply a position recorded in old texts and forgotten. It was something Satele lived with every day, not as an abstract position, but as a real personal tension that shaped her relationships and her choices. His belief had been preserved and passed forward. What to do with it was still being worked out hundreds of years after his death. The Jedi Order as an institution was also permanently shaped by the destruction the war against the Republic had brought. After the war's end, the Order took specific steps in direct response to what had happened. The Darth Bane series notes that the Jedi officially banned the Sith and their teachings in the aftermath of the conflict and worked actively to remove all Sith teaching tools, including Force-stored knowledge records. The presence of Sith philosophy in a form that could be found and used was seen as too dangerous to allow, given what that philosophy had produced when Revan and Malak had encountered it and made it their own. The Order's response was to try to remove the tools that could repeat the process. This effort was not fully successful. The stored knowledge record left on Leon was still there, waiting for Darth Bane 3,000 years later. But the intention behind the effort reflected a real understanding of what the war had shown. That contact with the Sith way of thinking, especially for someone already inclined to question the traditional Jedi approach, was a genuine and lasting danger that the Order could not simply ignore. The Far Outer Territories, for their part, remembered the former Sith Lord differently from how the Republic's core worlds did. Among populations that had experienced both the Mandalorian Wars and the war that followed it, Revan was not simply a traitor or an enemy to be written out of history. He was also, for many of those people, the person who had shown up when the official defenders were not showing up. The storyline notes that some people on the Outer Territories remembered him as a figure who saved the Republic, rather than the threat that the core worlds tried to remove from history. That split view was honest because he had done both things, often for reasons that were connected to each other rather than desperate. His legend did not become simpler after his death. It became more layered and more contested. The Revanite movement, the knowledge record on Leon, the descendants who carried his blood and his tensions into later centuries, the changes to the Jedi Order, the one master, one apprentice rule that governed the Sith until Darth Sidious dismantled it thousands of years later. These were all effects of a life that had refused to be simple or easy to categorize at any point. He had been a Jedi who would not wait while people suffered. He had been a soldier who won a war and lost himself in the process of winning it. He had been a Sith Lord who was still, underneath the years of dark side influence and the Emperor's control, something that the dark side cannot fully contain or permanently claim. He had been a prisoner who fought a battle no one knew about for 300 years. He had also been a husband and a father living on Coruscant, haunted by visions, who walked back into danger 2 years after his redemption because he cannot make peace with leaving it unaddressed. He never got to know whether Bastila and Vader were safe after he was taken. He spent 3 centuries working towards that outcome from inside a stasis chamber through a mental connection to the man who had imprisoned him, with no way of knowing if any of it was enough. The 5 words the novel uses to describe him, as hero, traitor, conqueror, villain, savior, are all accurate in the sense that each one describes something real about what he was at different points across his life, but none of them individually captures the most important thing, which is that the line between all 6 of them was much thinner than it appeared from the outside, and that the same qualities that made him capable of becoming each of those things was present in him at the same time. His brilliance was not separate from his danger. His love was not separate from his willingness to make choices that caused enormous harm. His return to the light did not erase what came before it. It simply added another chapter to a story that was never going to have a clean ending. The Jedi Council had been right to sense danger in the Mandalorian Wars. The young commander who defied them had been right that staying back while systems burned was a failure of the Order's most basic purpose. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the history of the Old Republic never fully settled which one mattered more. The people who studied his life kept arriving at different conclusions, and the ongoing disagreement is probably the most honest tribute that could be paid to a life that never settled those questions itself. Revan's legend does not end with his death. It becomes a model, a warning, and a symbol that the galaxy carries forward without fully understanding. Revan's life proves that the line between Jedi and Sith was never as clear as either side wanted to believe, and that the choices of one person made across a lifetime and then 3 centuries of silent resistance could reshape the galaxy in ways that outlasted every empire and every war he ever fought. However, the warning Revan left behind sat untouched in the Temple archives. The Order would not recognize the same fall when it happened to another Jedi prodigy. 4,000 years before Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, the Jedi Order had already watched the exact same thing happen once before. The Sith found a gifted young prodigy, isolated him from his teachers, convinced him the Council could not understand the threat he saw, and slowly turned him into a weapon against the Republic. His name was Revan. The Jedi wrote down exactly how it happened. Then they forgot to read it when Darth Sidious did it again. The first sign was small. Revan's fall began with a mask. The world was Cathar, and the war was the Mandalorian conflict, a brutal campaign of conquest waged by a warrior culture against any species that stood in its way. By the time Revan and his fellow Jedi arrived, most of the Cathar species had already been wiped out. The young knight walked through silent streets where the slaughter had ended a decade earlier, and only the wreckage remained, weathered into the rock. As light caught a Mandalorian helmet half buried near the shore, all the Jedi present shared a single Force vision, a Mandalorian woman in that helmet pleading with her commander, Cassius Fett, to spare the surviving Cathar, Fett refusing and the woman dying as she defended the people she had been sent to kill. Revan took up the helmet, vowing not to remove it until the Mandalorians were defeated, and in honoring the woman who had tried to stop the genocide, he made her unfinished work his own. What he did not admit, even to Malak, was that the vow was already changing him. He had taken a stranger's martyrdom and folded it into his own identity, casting himself as the one person who could finish a cause larger than himself. The old masters had warned their students for centuries about exactly this. A Jedi who starts believing he is the answer. The young prodigy believed himself above the warning because his cause was just. 4,000 years later, a different prodigy in a different war was telling himself a very similar story. Anakin Skywalker studied what the Council called forbidden knowledge and assured himself he would only use it to save the people he loved. He grew his friendship with Palpatine and told himself it was strictly political. He convinced himself, as Revan had, that pure intentions would purify the tools he picked up. The resemblance went deeper than judgment. Both were genuine prodigies, hailed in their own time as the finest Jedi alive, with strategic minds that humbled their teachers and a magnetism that began to look like personal loyalty. Revan led an entire faction of Jedi Knights into battle against the Council's clear orders during the Mandalorian Wars. The Chosen One drew the same kind of pull around himself during the Clone Wars, gaining devotion from clone troopers, political figures, and fellow Jedi alike. Both times, an order that valued group judgment watched one of its own and become the center of his own orbit. And both times, the Council answered with hesitation rather than action. The closest companion each prodigy kept carries the deepest echo. Revan's friendship with Malak was the defining bond of his early career, and through it, much of his corruption spread outward. When the future Dark Lord fell, Malak fell with him, two halves of the same disaster, one the visionary, the other the enforcer. Anakin's closest bond ran the opposite direction. Obi-Wan Kenobi was not a partner in his decline, he was a teacher trying constantly to pull his former apprentice back from it. Malak had no reason to resist Revan's pull, so he sped it up. Kenobi had every reason to resist Anakin's drift, and he did. But the Council placed on one young master's shoulders the burden that, in Revan's case, had needed an entire council to reverse. Revan did not simply slip into darkness, he was hunted into it, deliberately and patiently, by something the Jedi did not believe existed anymore. In the far reaches beyond the charted galaxy, on that same storm-racked world of German Kaz, a being who called himself Emperor had been preparing for centuries. The Jedi who eventually faced him called him Vishet. Vishet was not a conqueror, but a patient predator who had spent centuries studying how Jedi break. When the Mandalorian Wars sent a young prodigy chasing the defeated Mandalorians into the unknown regions, Vishet did not have to find Revan. He just had to wait. What happened on Dromund Kaas became one of the most important case studies the Jedi ever preserved, because the Jedi of the late Republic had this in writing. After defeating Mandalore the Ultimate, Revan had heard the truth from the dying warrior's own lips. The Sith's hold on Mandalore had broken in his final moments, and he told Revan that the entire Mandalorian campaign had been engineered by a Sith power hiding in the unknown regions. The two Jedi followed that thread alone, and in secret, all the way to the throne world. They believed they were the hunters. They did not understand that they were exactly where Vishet had been waiting. The Mandalorian Wars themselves had been a test, and the gifted Jedi who emerged victorious were the prize. Vishet did not need to befriend Revan or draw him in. The shape of Revan's life, his self-cast role as the one Jedi who saw what the Council refused to see, had already brought him to the throne room door. When that moment came, Vishet did not need a duel or years of grooming. He broke them. In a single confrontation, he dominated the minds of both Jedi at once and turned Revan's will toward the very dominion Revan had come to oppose. The men who walked out of that throne room still wore the faces of Revan and Malak, but the minds inside had been replaced. From that point forward, the Order knew exactly what this looked like. Vishet's method did not die with the Jedi Civil War. The Jedi who debriefed the restored Revan preserved it in careful detail. The records described, in concrete terms, the kind of Jedi a patient dark side operator looks for, a gifted prodigy who had already cast himself as the unique answer to a problem larger than his order, willing to follow that conviction past every safeguard the Council had built. 4,000 years later, Palpatine followed that script almost beat for beat. Sidious did not reveal himself as a Dark Lord. He approached first as an interested senator, then as a concerned statesman, and finally as the only political figure who seemed to take Anakin's ambitions seriously. He flattered the Chosen One's strategic instincts and isolated him politically through a web of secrets and unofficial assignments outside the Order's normal supervision. When the moment came, he did not defeat his target in combat, but reshaped him from within, turning Anakin's love for Padme into the lever that opened the door to the dark side. The Jedi Order of the late Republic knew the first one in heavy detail, and their tragedy was not that they had failed to predict Palpatine's method from nothing. It was that they had already survived it once, written down how it worked, and filed the instructions in a vault they no longer used. What makes the failure sharper still is that the old Jedi did not just write down the disease, they wrote down the cure. In the years after the Jedi Civil War, the Order pulled off something with no equal in the later history of the galaxy. They took a fully corrupted Dark Lord, a man who had led fleets against the Republic he had been raised to protect, and rebuilt him into a Jedi again, not through magic, but through patience, reconnection, and the careful repair of broken bonds. A young Jedi Knight named Bastila Shan led the strike team that boarded Revan's flagship to bring him in alive. They caught him at the moment Malak struck him down in Betrayal. Bastila used the Force to keep the dying Dark Lord alive and preserve his broken mind, and in doing so, she formed a Force bond with him. That bond was the lever the Council needed. through it, Revan's original self could be reached. What the Masters did next was morally questionable, and they knew it. They used the Force to wipe his memory and rebuild his identity from scratch, placing him back into Republic service under careful watch, surrounded by companions who knew nothing of his former life. The companions who served at his side had no idea the quiet, principled man fighting alongside them had once led fleets against the Republic. What they observed was not meditation, but behavior. He turned back to help worlds he had no orders to help, risked his life for crew members he barely knew, and extended trust to wary strangers who had every reason not to trust him. He was not being lectured back into the light, he was acting his way back into it, one decision at a time, consistently enough and long enough that the man he had been before Vishet began to come back on his own. The redemption of Revan was not a single miracle. A second case ran beside it and doubled the lesson. The Jedi exile Mitra Surik had served as one of Revan's generals during the Mandalorian campaigns. At Malachor V, she was caught at the heart of a weapon so terrible the trauma severed her connection to the Force. She wandered the galaxy afterward with no power, no order, and no identity beyond what the war had left her. When she returned, the Jedi who had once known her were nearly all dead, and the Order itself was teetering. Her return to the Force was guided by the most haunting character in this entire story, a woman named Kreia, who had once been a Jedi Master and Revan's own teacher before the Council exiled her for his fall. She had walked the dark path herself, taken the title of Darth Treya, been betrayed in turn by her own Sith apprentices, and emerged from the wreckage as something that was neither Jedi nor Sith, but had studied the machinery of both. Her body of philosophy, passed to Mitra Surik as her last student, argued that bonds forged in shared suffering could pull a Jedi back from the abyss or push them further into it, depending on who held the other end of the bond. The difference matters. What the Jedi had recorded about Revan was history, while what Kreia had taught was diagnosis. The students she shaped went on to rebuild the Jedi Order, and her core argument traveled with them. That the most dangerous moment in a young Jedi's life is not when he meets a Sith, but when he decides his teachers do not understand him, and that the bonds the Council tells him to release are the very ones that, properly held, could keep him in the light. Kreia's framework fits Anakin Skywalker exactly. By Kreia's reading, every intervention the Council made in Anakin's life was backward. Their insistence on emotional detachment was not protecting him from the dark side. It was actively preparing him for it, severing the bonds that could have held him in the light and leaving Palpatine's as the only one still standing. The Revan Protocol would have told them to tie those bonds tighter, not cut them loose. A council that understood the earlier rehabilitation would have treated Anakin's attachments as warning signals to guide carefully, not weaknesses to suppress. The case for how to do it was already sitting in the archives, but the Clone Wars Council was too tired, too stretched thin, too sure that old rules were enough. The Jedi archives, kept by Madame Jocasta Nu, were the most complete library of Force-related knowledge in the known galaxy. The Jedi Civil War had nearly destroyed the Order, and the Council that rebuilt it afterward had overseen Revan's rehabilitation firsthand. What they knew about how he fell and how he came back would have been among the most important records the Order ever kept. And then there is Jocasta Nu. The librarian held a file, but the Council did not ask. The system she had been hired to serve treated her domain as a memorial rather than as a working tool. It was not carelessness, it was exhaustion. The Clone Wars had turned the Jedi from teachers into generals. Masters who should have been mentoring Padawans were leading clone legions, and knights who should have been studying the archives were writing battle reports. No one had time to read a 4,000-year-old case file when there were campaigns to plan and soldiers to bury. But exhaustion was only half the problem. The Force itself had been clouded by the rising influence of the dark side, and Yoda and Mace Windu both said so openly. The dark side was not just hiding Palpatine, it was hiding the pattern. The same fog that made the Council unable to see the Sith Lord in the Senate was making them unable to see the Revan playbook running in front of them. Yoda, above all, should have caught it. Yoda had been alive for nearly 9 centuries. The Revan case was among the most heavily documented cautionary examples in the Order's history, and a master of Yoda's age and learning would have had access to it. When he sensed fear in young Anakin during his first testing on Coruscant, the pattern recognition should have been immediate. A gifted child, already shaped by attachments he cannot release, showing fear as his main emotional signal, was exactly the kind of candidate the Revan case had warned against. He named the risk clearly, but what he and the Council did not do was commit to the intervention it called for. They voiced the warning without acting on it. By the time the war began, the boy they had reluctantly admitted was already a man, already a knight, already in regular private conversation with the Sith Lord they could not see. By the final year of the Clone Wars, the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was happening in plain sight. Anyone paying attention could see it. Anakin Skywalker was already halfway gone. The clone troopers of the 501st Legion loved their general because he fought like no other Jedi, took risks no careful commander would take, and formed attachments the Order had always taught its knights to restrain. Other Jedi saw different pieces of the same collapse. Anakin's growing dependence on Palpatine, his resentment toward the Council, his willingness to move outside the normal chain of command. All of it pointed towards the same pattern the Revan records had preserved for thousands of years. The correct response in the Revan precedent had been to pull the drifting Jedi out of the dark side's reach immediately and surround him with the community he had started to leave behind. The Council's response in Anakin's case was almost the exact opposite. The deeper problem was that the Jedi no longer believed the Sith could operate this way at all. The Jedi of the late Republic had built their modern identity around the idea that their ancient enemies were extinct. The Revan archives directly contradicted that idea. To take those warnings seriously as a live diagnosis, the Council would have had to admit that their basic reading of their own era was wrong, that the Sith were not extinct and were operating in the Senate at that moment. They could not make that admission in time. The Chosen One paid the price for their hesitation. By the final year of the Clone Wars, the pattern reached the opera box on Coruscant. The legend of Darth Plagueis the Wise was not idle conversation. It was a precision strike aimed at the same psychological weakness Vishet had once exploited in Revan. The belief that enough knowledge, enough power, could protect the people once loved from forces the Jedi refused to face. Any master familiar with the Revan archives would have recognized Palpatine's story as a textbook opening move. Anakin heard it and went home to worry about Padme. The Council had every resource to understand what had just been attempted, and no system in place to act. And yet, the protocol the Jedi had forgotten was not lost forever. It found its way back into the galaxy through the most unlikely route imaginable. Luke Skywalker received none of the archive training that his father's generation had thrown away. He was taught by an exile Yoda in the swamps of Dagobah and by a hidden Obi-Wan Kenobi in the wastes of Tatooine. Neither teacher walked him through the Revan file, explained the rehabilitation protocol, or offered him a framework for spotting when a fallen Jedi might still be reachable through the restoration of bonds. The farm boy from Tatooine worked the method out himself through instinct and love and the strange inheritance of being his father's son. And then he walked, alone and unarmed, into the throne room of the Emperor. Through the lens of the Revan file, every choice Luke makes is the right one, though he makes them without knowing the file exists. He arrives in binders, surrendering himself willingly, knowing he cannot fight his way to his father, but has to come to him. He stands before Vader and calls him by his old name, Anakin Skywalker, not the Sith title and not the rank. This is the same move Bastila Shan had used 4,000 years earlier, refusing to let the captured Dark Lord answer to the title he had built for himself, insisting on the man underneath. Vader rejects the name, telling his son that it no longer means anything to him. But the young Jedi does not retreat. He tells his father that he can feel the conflict inside him, that there is good in him still. Luke is doing exactly what the Revan rehabilitation had done, forcing the bond, refusing to sever it, treating the fallen as recoverable when every voice of caution would have called for execution. The Emperor watches. Sidious has spent his life closing exactly this kind of door, and he knows that if the boy succeeds, the work of 1,000 years collapses with it. So he engineers the duel, hoping the act of fighting will burn the bond away. It almost works. Luke is driven into rage and nearly takes the dark path himself, but standing over his defeated father, he looks at his own hand, sees the mechanical hand that mirrors Vader's, and stops. He throws the lightsaber away, then turns to face the Emperor and tells him he's a Jedi, like his father before him. The bond has not been severed, the fallen has not been lost, and the man underneath the armor is still Anakin Skywalker. The Emperor strikes, pouring dark-side lightning into the boy. He intends to kill him slowly, in front of the man who once was a Jedi, and in that moment, Anakin Skywalker chooses. He picks up his master, carries him to the reactor shaft, and throws him down it. Anakin Skywalker, in the final moments of his life, returned to the light and destroyed the master who had corrupted him, and the only person who managed it was the one who had never read the file. This is the deepest revelation of the Revan and Vader parallel. The Jedi Order did not fall because the dark side was too strong. It fell because the Order stopped being curious about its own past. When an institution treats its history as decoration instead of a working tool, it will eventually run into a threat it has already beaten once and have no idea what it is looking at. Revan left them a record of exactly how it worked. The Order preserved it for 4,000 years, and then sent their most gifted knight to spend private evenings with the man running the same operation. And a son raised in obscurity on a desert planet ended up doing for his father what an entire council, surrounded by the greatest library in the galaxy, could not bring itself to do for one of its own. The record was complete, but the council just never opened it. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video you might like.